In this video, we'll be going over class and faction-specific racials in World of Warcraft. First up, we'll be going over priest racials, because they were the only class with class racials until the Burning Crusade, and they varied wildly in ability and what they could do. We start off with the Troll Priest racial, Shadow Guard. This ability put a lightning shield-like barrier around the caster. This shadowy shield had 3 charges, and would consume one of these charges when attacked. It would then deal shadow damage back to the attacker. With no cooldown, you could easily keep this buff up forever, allowing for the priest to punish those attacking them with retaliating shadow damage, even having the benefit of causing 0 threat with this damage. For Shadow Priest, this racial was insanely powerful in PvP, proccing multiple effects and even healing the priest, because after all, it was shadow damage. Although for healing priests, the mana would be far better spent elsewhere. Next, we have Desperate Prayer. This was available to humans and dwarves, and this racial was an instant cast heal that cost no mana. Which sounds pretty good, right? Well, it had some limitations. First, it had a 30-minute cooldown. And second, it was only self-cast, so you could only use it on yourself. Although its 30-minute cooldown was later reduced to only 10 minutes, and it became affected by talents that buffed holy spells, and did not go through many changes. Star Shards, the Night Elf Priest racial. This ability was a channeled dot that dealt arcane damage, a damage-type priest did not normally have access to. A 6-second channel that allowed you to burst some arcane damage into your enemy. Later changed to work more like Curse of Agony, causing its damage to slowly build up, starting weak and ending strong, while also reducing its mana cost and increasing its damage. Next, we have Touch of Weakness. This was the racial for the Undead. The racial is as it sounds, the Undead would cast the spell, giving them a buff, and then on their next melee attack would consume the buff to apply a debuff to the enemy, while also dealing some shadow damage. This debuff was a curse that weakened the enemy's physical damage done. And well, I'm sure you can understand why this one was a bit odd. A priest doing melee damage? So they changed it in patch 1.10 to be when an enemy melees you instead of you having to melee them. Otherwise it was the same, although with a much lower mana cost. The only place this could really be seen as useful was in PvP, although the original one is a nice way to get a Curse of Weakness on a boss if you didn't have a Warlock, I guess. Next, we have Hex of Weakness. This was the second priest racial ability for trolls. This ability, when cast on a target, would just reduce their damage by a small amount. Then in patch 1.10, it also reduced their healing by 20% for 2 minutes. And with no cooldown, this was quite a good ability. Great against bosses that could heal if you had no Mortal Strike warriors, and also against dual-wielding classes. At least in its second version. Its original, without the reduced healing, was not that great. It's also a great ability to use against other priests, as the only way to dispel it was with a mage, as it had the niche distinction of counting as a curse spell school, the only curse that priests were able to use. Next, we have Feedback. This spell was a human priest racial, which when cast would buff your weapon, giving it a chance to drain a fixed amount of mana from your enemy, and for each mana drained, you would take 1 damage. Although, like many of the others in patch 1.10, it got a redesign. It now surrounded the priest in a shield, and any spell against them would burn away mana and deal damage to them, allowing human priests to drain mana and damage anyone who casts spells on them. Enemies, that is. Next, we have Elun's Grace, the other Night Elf priest ability. This was a buff they could cast on themselves that lasted 3 minutes, which just reduced the range physical damage they took by a small amount. Although, again, like other priest racials in patch 1.10, it was reworked, this time into more of a defensive cooldown, with a 15-second duration and a 5-minute cooldown, where it reduced range damage taken and increased dodge chance. It didn't stay like this for very long though, so just ignore the on-screen tooltip of this ability as it shows its last iteration. We'll go into its changes once we enter the TBC era. Next, we go into Fear Ward, the dwarf priest-only ability, which is pretty well known as the most powerful priest racial in Classic WoW, and was one of the reasons Alliance was the stronger faction in Vanilla. Fear effects were very common in Vanilla raids, and having your tank get feared is a quick way to wipe. So, what Fear Ward did was, with a 30-second cooldown and 10-minute duration, you could cause the next fear effect cast on the target to be ignored. And this was insane. It made many fights trivial by simply having a single dwarf priest or 2. Your tank would never need to worry about suddenly turning their back to the boss for several seconds at a time, and simply tank as usual. Technically, the Horde had the option of the Shaman Tremor Totem to counter fears as well, but they were nowhere near as easy to use or good as Fear Ward, as Tremor Totem in Vanilla WoW would pulse its AoE Fear Cleanse every 4 seconds, and had to be thrown down right next to the tank because it was possible for them to just be feared out of its really short 20-yard radius. Lastly, we have Devouring Plague, a spell granted to undead priests. It was simply an instant cast 3-minute cooldown dot that dealt a high shadow damage, and healed the caster for the damage dealt, which I'm sure you can understand was great for shadow priests, who already have lots of shadow damage bonuses, and Vampiric Embrace, which allowed them to heal themselves with their shadow damage. Now, if you've ever wondered why priests were the only class in Vanilla WoW with racial-specific spells, a good explanation on why comes from the Josh Corbett podcast done, where they interviewed Kevin Jordan, a lead class designer from Classic.
We had this ambitious idea, of course, when you feel like you have endless time to do things, that we would have racial abilities for lots of different classes. That there would be, the Dwarf Warrior could do this, and the Tauren Warrior would be able to do this, and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, once we realized how much less time we actually had to work on this game, not 20 years, we figured that it was super, or I held the idea that it was super important on the priest, whereas we could cut the other classes in terms of racial abilities. And the reason it was so important on the priest was because it was trying to convey the culture of so many different races and their backgrounds and their connection to a type of religion or god that they might be invested in. So a troll priest and an undead priest is very different than a dwarf priest.
This podcast also debunked the whole notion that Disc Priest was meant to be a tank, which is a pretty common rumor in the community. So I'll just play that clip right here as well.
Yeah, it was never intended that the discipline tree be a tank spec. That was just a retroactive thing. I was brainstorming with some people that we were chatting with.
Now onto the Burning Crusade and the intro of the Draenei and Blood Elves, who could both be priests, as well as paladins. Originally, the paladin was a class only for Alliance, where the Horde got the shaman. But with the Burning Crusade, they swapped, adding shamans to Alliance and paladins to Horde. And so to keep a bit of that faction flavor, they added faction-specific seals for the paladins, one for Alliance and one for Horde. The Seal of Vengeance was the Alliance seal introduced in the Burning Crusade. This seal was pretty simple. Every time you did a melee attack while the seal was active, you had a chance to apply a dot to the enemy that dealt holy damage over 12 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. The seal lasted for 30 seconds, but with no cooldown, instant cast, and only a small mana cost, it wasn't that much of an issue to reapply it. Another thing you could do was blast the enemy for a large amount of holy damage based on the amount of applications of Holy Vengeance when you hit the enemy with Judgment. The seal was very useful for tanks, as it allowed you to apply dots to targets to generate threat, even during a threat wipe. Also very useful against rogues, as it would break them out of Vanish if they tried to get away. Seal of Blood was the seal available only to Horde paladins, at the time just Blood Elves. This dealt far more damage than Seal of Vengeance, the Alliance counterpart, and this seal added holy damage to all your melee attacks, but the paladin would take 10% of the damage dealt to their health, and casting Judgment with this seal would instantly deal a large amount of holy damage to the target, which would also deal about 33% of the damage back to the paladin when they used it. So as you can see, the seal was meant to do a lot of damage, but at the cost of self-damage. And so I'm sure you could see the comparisons. The Alliance seal was far better for tanking, while this seal was far better for DPS, especially as it dealt damage based on the weapon damage, which of course two-handers hit a lot harder than one-handers. Fun fact, the seal's holy damage counted as a second melee hit, so it could be blocked, dodged, and parried. Now for the priest racials in the Burning Crusade. First we have Elun's Grace, which got reworked to work like what the tooltip on screen actually says, to now reduce the chance to be hit by melee and ranged attacks by 20% for 15 seconds with a 3-minute cooldown, instead of granting dodge chance on a longer 5-minute cooldown like it used to. A straight 20% chance to cause physical attacks to miss was quite the improvement and turned it into more of a legitimate defensive cooldown. Next, Fear Ward got given to Draenei as well as being available to Dwarves, and then in patch 2.3 it was right out removed from Dwarf and Draenei as a racial ability, and was now given to all priests, which made it a baseline ability for nearly the rest of WoW until the ability was removed in Legion. Star Shards was also changed. No longer ramping up in damage, it dealt the same damage the entire duration, and it was no longer a channeled ability. Now simply a dot with a 15-second duration, 30-second cooldown, and dealt arcane damage every 3 seconds, making it the only arcane school dot that priests ever had access to. Now onto the new priest abilities. First, we have Consume Magic. This was the new priest racial introduced with the Blood Elves. This ability, with a 2-minute cooldown, dispelled one beneficial magical effect from the caster, giving themselves a large chunk of mana. This was great for long fights, as removing simple self-buffs like Inner Fire or Power Word Fortitude could be used to gain mana when needed the most at the end of a big fight, when mana is low and the min-maxing of those buffs doesn't matter. Especially since it did not care about the rank of the ability. You could simply cast rank 1 Inner Fire, then consume it for the full value. Or Touch of Weakness, which was originally the undead-only priest racial, now available to blood elves as well. Symbol of Hope, the new priest racial given to Draenei, with a 5-minute cooldown and an instant cast. This gave your party a buff, giving them mana every 5 seconds for 15 seconds, which was a pretty decent mana return racial that also benefited your party. Draenei racials seem to have a theme of being helpful to party members, as their Heroic Presence racial gave their party a passive 1% hit buff, and their Gift of the Naru racial heal could be cast on other players, really breaking the mold of most racials being self-buffs only. With Fear Ward becoming available to all priests, Chastise was given in its place to Draenei and Dwarves. A 30-second cooldown instant cast ability, it dealt a decent chunk of holy damage to an enemy, while also disorienting them for 2 seconds. It also generated very low threat, but only worked on humanoids, although in the very next patch of 2.4, it got changed from a disorient to a root, and had its cooldown removed. And before we move on to Wrath of the Lich King, let's talk about Bloodlust and Heroism. These spells were abilities that gave all party members 30% melee and ranged attack speed, as well as spellcasting speed for 40 seconds. Now remember, this only worked on party members, not the whole raid, so just the shaman and 4 of its party allies. This spell had a 10-minute cooldown and no Sata debuff, meaning for every shaman you had, they could cast this ability every 10 minutes. And it was quite powerful, and I can see shaman stacking probably being a thing in TBC Classic. Fun fact, Heroism actually cost less to train than Bloodlust did for the first patch of the Burning Crusade, despite the fact that it was literally the same ability, just with a different name. And now, onto Wrath of the Lich King. First, we will quickly finish off Bloodlust and Heroism. They got slightly reworked. They now affected everyone in the entire raid instead of just the party. And they now only had a 5-minute cooldown, but to make this not insanely broken, they added the Sated debuff, which causes a player to be unable to be affected by Bloodlust or Heroism for 5 minutes, after receiving the effect of those spells. So you could no longer stack shamans in one group to grant your highest DPS more uptime on Bloodlust. And sadly, this is when they removed priest racials, as they wanted players to have more freedom to choose what race they wanted their priest to be. So with this change, they made a few of the racials baseline. A Desperate Prayer became a talent in the Holy Tree and had a much shorter cooldown. It's now just a standard baseline ability today. Symbols of Hope was renamed to Hymn of Hope and made available to all priests. Chastise was removed from the game, although it did come back as Holy Word Chastise and Cataclysm, and became a staple of their Holy Tree as their specific damage-dealing spell. Devouring Plague was made available to all priests and stayed in the game until it was removed in Legion, although being re-added in Shadowlands. And the rest were removed, which includes Star Shards, Touch of Weakness, Hex of Weakness, Feedback, Elun's Grace, Shadow Guard, and Consume Magic. And while priests had their special unique benefit removed in Wrath of the Lich King, for some reason paladins were special and kept theirs. Sort of. And so in Wrath of the Lich King, they got altered slightly, as well as sort of new seals being added to the racial seal list. Seal of Vengeance with Wrath of the Lich King procced with every single swing, as well as its damage being affected by attack and spell power, as well as having its duration increased to 30 minutes like all other seals. This made the ability much more manageable and much more powerful. Then in 3.2 it was slightly reworked. Auto attacks and Hammer of Righteousness place a debuff on the target, and while the seal is active, each melee swing on the ability, excluding Judgment, that hit the target dealt a percentage of weapon damage as holy, maxing out at 33% with 5 stacks of the seal. This holy damage dealt double crit damage as well, unlike normal dots. And for Seal of Blood, not much change really. It still did extra damage at the cost of HP, but also got a 30-minute duration added just like Seal of Vengeance. Paladins then got 2 brand new racial seals. Our first new seal is the Seal of Martyr for Alliance. This seal was the exact same as Seal of Blood. It caused your melee attacks to deal 27 additional holy damage, but lose health equal to 10% of the damage inflicted, and also deal bonus holy damage when casting Judgment at the cost of 33% damage done to your health. Our next seal is the Seal of Corruption for Horde. This seal, just like the Seal of Vengeance, applied a dot to the enemy that stacked up to 5 times, while also causing your attacks to deal bonus holy damage and also casting Judgment dealt a large amount of holy damage, increased by 10% for each stack of seal you had on the target. So in Wrath of the Lich King, they seemingly wanted to remove the special feature of Paladins, and gave both factions both seals, but with a simple rename, as Seal of Martyr and Seal of Blood were literally the exact same, as were Seal of Corruption and Seal of Vengeance. As then in patch 3.2, they right out removed Seal of the Martyr and Seal of Blood, likely not liking the playstyle of Paladins sacrificing their own health to increase their DPS. While it is a cool ability, it built some bad habits of over-relying on your healers to keep you healed so that you can do optimal DPS, and it would straight kill you in fights with increased damage to things. So while we did still have racial seals, they were the exact same at this point, but with just different names, kind of like Bloodlust and Heroism. And then in the Cataclysm, the racial seals were removed, and Bloodlust and Heroism stayed the same. Exact same spell, but with different names for each faction, although Time Warp and Ancient Hysteria got added. Other ways to gain this haste effect: Time Warp for mages for both factions, and Ancient Hysteria from hunters. And that's it for Clash racials, as they were never used again. Although, something to mention, in the coming Burning Crusade Classic, these seals are being given to both factions in order to better balance the factions at the start. Now, both Horde and Alliance will have access to Seal of Vengeance and Seal of Blood. In this video, we'll talk about the racial abilities of perhaps the most iconic, or at least the most played race in WoW, the Blood Elves. Added in the Burning Crusade alongside the Draenei, they have since become the most popular race in the game. And while their racials are pretty good, it is mostly because of how they look, as to this day, they are one of the prettiest races in the game, and the first pretty race added to the Horde. Before the Burning Crusade, the Horde only had monster races to choose from, and actually had a lower population as a result. Adding Blood Elves to the Horde in the Burning Crusade single-handedly evened out the ratios, and was the start of the Horde's larger overall numbers. Turns out, aesthetics are somewhat important to a lot of players. Anyways, starting out with the actual racials, nice and simple with an ability that, much like the Human's Diplomacy racial, has never changed since it was added to the game. And that is Arcane Affinity. This gave Blood Elves a plus 10 to the enchanting profession should they decide to be enchanters. Next we have their Resistance racial, though this Resistance racial is a bit special. Blood Elves got the Magic Resistance ability. Now, while most Resistance racials gave plus 10 to a specific school of magic, Magic Resistance gave Blood Elves a plus 5 to every school of magic. At least every school of magic that had a resistance stat, as there was no player character holy resistance in the game. Now, moving on to the most iconic of the racials, let's talk about Arcane Torrent. At launch, Arcane Torrent was an 8-yard silence on a 2-minute cooldown that also restored mana based on the number of mana tap stacks you had, which brings us to the last racial from the Burning Crusade, that being Mana Tap. Mana Tap had a 30-second cooldown, and reduced the target's mana by a little bit. It also gave you a buff that lasted for 10 minutes and stacked up to 3 times, each stack increasing the amount of mana the Arcane Torrent granted. Mana Tap itself cost 0 mana and was instant cast, which gave it some interesting uses in PvP. If a healer is trying to rest and drink and regen mana, you can just hit them with Mana Tap as it had a 30-yard range, reducing their mana and also keeping them in combat longer so that you could close the distance before they can really regain their mana. It's also worth noting, however, that Mana Tap did not work on any targets that did not have mana, be that player or NPC. Without a mana bar, it wouldn't do anything, so it wasn't super reliable if you wanted a ranged way to pull mobs on a melee character. In the cinematic for the Burning Crusade, when you first see the Blood Elf and she sucks the mana out of the mana worm killing it, that is what Mana Tap did in lore. Moving on to Wrath of the Lich King, we will start off with Magic Resistance, which suddenly became the strongest resistance racial ever. It could be argued that it gave more resistances back in the Burning Crusade too, but I think it really hit its peak here, as all resistance racials were changed from giving a plus 10 to a single resistance stat, or in the case of Magic Resistance, a plus 5 to a resistance stat, to now reducing the chance to be hit by spells of that school by 2%. But while the Frost Resistance of the Dwarf racial reduced the chance to be hit by frost spells by 2%, and the Undead Shadow Resistance reduced the chance to be hit by Shadow Resistance by 2%, the Blood Elves Magic Resistance reduced the chance to be hit by all spells by 2%, no matter what the school the incoming spell came from. Moving on to Mana Tap, it was removed from the game, and the mana gained from Arcane Torrent became baseline. No need for stacking the Mana Tap buff. They did give a lore reason for it though, saying that with the Sunwell reignited, the Blood Elves no longer needed to tap mana from other creatures. Though, despite its removal early on, it is still referenced in the game to this day, with the female Blood Elf / flirt emote.
My mana tap brings all the boys to the yard.
Which is pretty interesting given how long ago it was removed. Arcane Torrent had quite a number of changes throughout Wrath. As stated before with mana tap's removal, it now gave a flat amount of mana when used. Though in a patch early on, silences were changed to have diminishing returns, and this included Arcane Torrent. In patch 3.2, in addition to its silence effect, it now also applied a 3-second interrupt effect when used on NPCs, so that it was now usable in creatures that were immune to silence effects. This did not have any extra effects in PvP though, as it only affected non-player characters to give Blood Elves a way to interrupt bosses. Though funnily enough, the tooltip for it was not updated to reflect this change until patch 3.3, at which time the cast bar UI was changed to properly reflect that yes, Arcane Torrent was interrupting things. The Cataclysm was light on changes for Blood Elves. Really, there was only one. Magic resistance was removed and replaced with arcane resistance. And as with all resistance racials, it was changed to give a scaling amount of arcane resistance based on your character's level in Cataclysm. But arcane resistance is a specific stat, so they no longer got resistance to all schools of magic. And it was now just arcane magic that they resisted. Which was a pretty fair change, since it was the best resistance racial in the game's history to this point. It was now just in line with all the other resistance racials. Mists of Pandaria gave two pretty simple changes. Arcane resistance was changed along with all the other resistance racials to just give a flat 1% reduction to a specific damage type. In the Blood Elves case, it was a 1% damage reduction from arcane damage. The other change in Mists of Pandaria came to the Arcane Torrent racial in 5.1. A blue post of the patch stated Arcane Torrent now returns 2% base mana, was previously an unintended 6%. So a pretty significant nerf all things considered, no longer making it one of the best races to pick as certain healers. In Warlords of Draenor, the Blood Elves got a new racial in the form of Arcane Acuity, which increased their critical chance by 1%, and hey, getting something for free is just fine. Not a huge boost, but a boost nonetheless, as they were trying to give all racials an actual DPS increase to kind of even them out more here. The other change going into WoD was Arcane Torrent again. It now gives Death Knights 20 runic power instead of 15, and gave Paladins 1 holy power instead of just mana, for the specs that didn't care about the mana return. It now also gave 3% mana to mages, priests, and warlocks, up from 2% from MoP. Then in patch 6.2.2, they reduced the cooldown from 2 minutes it had in TBC, all the way down to 1.5 minutes. Again, a welcome change. From here on out, the only changes of Blood Elves racials are tweaks to Arcane Torrent. At the start of Legion, it was changed to now give mana to Holy and Protection Paladins instead of Holy Power, though Retribution Paladins still got the Holy Power. Then in patch 7.1, it now generated 15 Insanity for Shadow Priests. The last change came as when we went to Zandalari and Kulturas, where in Battle for Azeroth, it was reworked entirely to now be in effect like a purge. It now removes one beneficial magical effect from all enemies in range instead of being a silence. Now, many people saw this as a nerf, as a silence is really good. Way better than an AoE purge. But, while it was changed, Blizzard also added in a few places where it was very useful. At the start of one of the dungeons in King's Rest, there was a bunch of little abomination ads that had really low HP, but a buff that gave them a shield with a whole bunch of extra HP. However, if a Blood Elf could run in and just pop Arcane Torrent, you could kill all of them really easily. The only other way to kill all these ads at once was a mass dispel from a priest. These mobs also showed up in the first raid of the expansion Uldir, where during the Prophet Zul boss fight, Zul would summon a group of these ads, which would either require a mass dispel or a Blood Elf to go over and deal with them. So while purge effects isn't as useful as a silence, Blizzard made sure the Blood Elves still had a use for it to ease the blow, and kept adding important effects that are better to be purged going forward. Basically, Blizzard knew a whole bunch of players were Blood Elves, and they didn't want to nerf their racials, so they made sure that the racial would be useful by just adding in purgeable effects. The Burning Crusade added the first new races to the game, the Blood Elves and the Draenei. This was the first time the Alliance could be shamans and the Horde could be paladins. And in this video, we'll be talking about the history of racials for the Draenei. The Draenei have 4 racials. While each of these racials have seen some changes, unlike most other racials, they still have all of the same racials they did when they were first added to the game. First up is Gift of the Naru. This was a little hot on a 3-minute cooldown that had a 1.5 second cast time and a 40-yard range. It wasn't the biggest heal. At level 70, it was only about 1,000 health over 15 seconds. But the thing is, it didn't cost any mana to cast. And if you were a healer using it with a whole bunch of plus healing gear on, it scaled like any other heal, making it a phenomenal heal, especially for healers as, again, required 0 mana. and mana-free abilities are very valuable for healers, for all of you non-healers out there. The next racial we'll talk about is gem cutting. This is as simple as any racial can be. It gave the Draenei a +5 skill if they decided to take the new jewelcrafting profession that came out with the Burning Crusade. Shadow Resistance is up next. The Draenei's Shadow Resistance followed the exact same set of changes as the Shadow Resistance of the Undead. So if you see my video of the history of Undead racials, you'll know that it fades as time goes on. But if you haven't seen the video, be sure to check it out after you're finished watching this one. I'll leave a link at the end. Anyways, what Shadow Resistance did was give the Draenei a +10 to their Shadow Resistance stat. Now, last but not least, we have the Draenei's Heroic Presence, or Inspiring Presence. They're both basically the same thing, so I'm only going to be showing Heroic Presence on screen. This racial alone was the reason why you wanted at least one Draenei per party in your raid. What it did was give all of your party members either 1% hit or 1% spell hit. Draenei warriors, hunters, and paladins had Heroic Presence, giving 1% hit to all party members within 30 yards, while mages, shamans, and priests had Inspiring Presence, which gave party members 1% spell hit if they were within 30 yards of you. As with most things early on in WoW, this ability was party-wide and not raid-wide. This meant that you wanted one Draenei per party to give the boost to hit, which was incredibly impactful. Wrath of the Lich King brought a few changes to the Draenei's racials. Inspiring Presence was removed and its effect was rolled into Heroic Presence, which now gave both 1% hit and spell hit. It still remained only party-wide, however. Even with these limitations, this puts Heroic Presence in the running for one of the most overpowered racials in the game's history. This meant Alliance players could just straight up plan their gear around needing one less hit chance, which was a pretty significant amount for some classes, like Hunters who only needed 8% chance to hit total, so that 1% was actually about 13% of their total hit chance needed. And if you read guides from this time period online, you'll see them give stat weight suggestions for Horde players, and then different ones if you know you're going to have a Draenei in your party. Shadow Resistance was changed as all other resistance racials were to give a flat 2% reduced chance to be hit by shadow spells. Gem cutting remained the same, but Gift of the Naru had the mounted heal changed to now be increased by either your attack or spell power, whichever is higher, and made its attack bar immune to pushback. Pushback, for anyone who isn't aware, is when a caster is casting a spell, but they get hit by something and the cast is, well, pushed back. So, having a heal that now scales its spell power, costs no mana, and now is immune to pushback is still really nice. This didn't last too long, however, as with patch 3.1, it was changed to be instant cast, and you can't push back an instant cast spell. As Deathwing rose and brought about the Cataclysm, new abilities were granted to the races of Azeroth that some may deem unnatural. Heroic Presence was nerfed, so now instead of providing your Heroic Presence to others in your party, it only affected yourself. It was still a fantastic racial, just no longer bonkers like it was previously. Gem cutting was buffed by a whole 50%, so now it has a fantastic +10 jewelcrafting skill. So while it was changed, it didn't really change anything and was still as incredibly minor as it always had been. Then the resistance racials were changed again to now increase your resistance stat by 1 per level, so +1 shadow resistance at level 1 and a +85 shadow resistance at max level. Then in one of the minor patches early on, Gift of the Naru was also changed to now heal a flat 20% of the target's health over 15 seconds, rather than a scaling value. This is the first and only expansion where all of the Draenei's racials were changed, as gem cutting has only ever been changed once since the Draenei were added to the game. Mist of Pandaria only brought 2 changes. The first was to shadow resistance, and that was because all the resistance racials were changed into their final form, so far, which made them reduce all damage taken from that school of magic by 1%. So for a Draenei with shadow resistance, that means 1% less shadow damage. Second was a Gift of the Naru nerf to make it so it only healed the target for 20% of the caster's maximum health instead of the target's. So it no longer got huge benefits to cast it on the tank, who would always have the highest HP of the raid and are always priority heal targets. Warlords of Draenor also brought a couple of changes to the Draenei, as they've returned to one of their many homes in their 10,000-year journey from hiding from the Legion, even if it was in an alternative timeline. Firstly, Gift of the Naru was changed to essentially heal faster. The duration of the hot was reduced from 15 seconds down to just 5 seconds, while still healing the same amount. The second change was to Heroic Presence. It was now redesigned to no longer increase hit and spell hit by 1%, but instead just give a flat amount of strength, agility, and intellect. Although whatever class you are, 2 of those 3 stats do pretty much nothing for you. This change was done because they basically removed the hit chance stat from the game, ending the reign of Draenei having one of the most powerful stat boosting racials in the game. To date, this is the last time the Draenei's racials have changed, But in Legion, the Lightforged Draenei were added to the game. With patch 7.3.5 in Legion, the Lightforged Draenei become a playable race that have 5 racials. First, they have Light's Judgment, which on a 2.5 minute cooldown lets you call down a holy energy to deal damage to enemies within 5 yards after 3 seconds. It's a little confusing because while casting it is instant, there is a delay before the damage is dealt. But according to some of the min-maxing websites like Hero Damage or Blood Mallet, this ability makes the Lightforge really good in Mythic Plus. This ability seems to be the equivalent of the normal Draenei's gift to the Naru, but it deals damage instead of healing. Next, they have Forge of Light, which on a 15-minute cooldown lets you summon an anvil and gives you a +10 to blacksmithing. Of the profession racials, this is actually one of the better ones due to the anvil summoning, so that you can actually do your smithing on the go, but still overall isn't impactful and is pure flavor. Next is Demon Bane, which increases the experience gained from killing demons by 20%. This was the second ever XP increasing racial, the other being the Troll's Beast Slaying racial, which was changed from dealing an extra 5% damage to beasts in World of Draenor, to instead grant an extra 20% experience from killing them. Their third racial's Light's Reckoning, which causes you to erupt when you die and deal holy damage to enemies within 8 yards, as well as healing allies in range as well. Very reminiscent of Tyrael's Death ability in Heroes of the Storm. And interestingly, on the PTR, this racial was originally called Final Verdict, but likely changed to its final name, Light's Reckoning, as Final Verdict already existed as one of the Paladin's main abilities, and this could have become even more confusing as, for flavor reasons, many people would probably be making Lightforged Draenei Paladins anyway. And lastly, the Lightforged Draenei's 5th racial is a Holy Resistance, which is, with all other resistance racials, reduces holy damage taken by 1%. So while there has never been a Holy Resistance stat in the game, Lightforge got a form of Holy Protection with its ironically named racial. So far, the racials have not seen any revisions, but they are still a very new race in the grand scheme of the game, so there is time. And that's it! Since Warlords of Draenor, the original Draenei racials haven't changed. Aside from specific number scalings on heroic presence with the stat, level squishes, and when professions were broken up by expansions, so the +10 to Jewelcrafting from gem cutting was added to each expansion's Jewelcrafting individually. The same happened with the Lightforge and their blacksmithing skill. Instead, they just added an entirely new Draenei race through the new allied race system. But who knows? With Blizzard saying we'll be going out and exploring the cosmos, maybe we'll find more Draenei out there, and their racials will get an update then. In this video, we'll be talking about the racial abilities of the Dwarf race, and not to be confused with the Dark Iron Dwarf. Starting out nice and simple, we have Frost Resistance. Back in vanilla, each school of magic had a resistance stat for it, and what this racial did was give you a +10 to your Frost Resistance stat. This increased your chance to resist damage from that school for various different frost-related things. In PvE, Frost Resistance was not very useful, except on Saphirion and Axaramis. In PvP, however, it was much more useful at resisting the Frostbolt of a mage, which could be a lifesaver. Next up, we have Find Treasure. This was an ability you can activate that lets you track treasures on your minimap, like the Find Herbs and Find Minerals abilities you got when you learned Herbalism or Mining, respectively. It would add a little yellow dot to your minimap, just tracking treasure chests and lockboxes, as well as certain quest items instead of resource nodes. Most of the time it was kind of useless because of the low respawn rate of chests, but it was a perfectly flavorful ability to have. Thirdly, dwarves got gun specialization, which, like all the other weapon racial specializations, added a +5 to the dwarves' weapon skill with guns. In vanilla, this was okay while leveling, but unfortunately all the best endgame weapons were either bows or crossbows, so it wasn't competitive as other weapon skill racials. Lastly, the most interesting of the racials, we have Stone Form. When activated, this granted immunity to bleed, poison, and disease effects, in addition to increasing the dwarf's armor by 10% for 8 seconds, all on a 3-minute cooldown. This was really good, especially in PvP, as it would remove a rogue's poisons or warrior's bleeds, or both. It could even remove a rogue's blind, as during vanilla it was considered a poison rather than a physical attack. This racial made dwarves a good pick for PvP early on, and while not as impactful now, it still remains a decent enough choice for PvP. Later on in patch 1.6 in vanilla, it enabled you to also remove self-inflicted poisons for instances when your poisons got reflected back onto you, since for some reason the racial made a distinction about that early on. During the Burning Crusade, nothing changed for the racials at launch, but later on in patch 2.2, the rogue's blind was changed to be a physical attack school, so Stone Form could no longer be used to make yourself immune to it. Then in the next patch of 2.3, when weapon skills were all changed from +5 skills to +5 expertise, range skills were also rebalanced. But since ranged weapons didn't use expertise, they instead were given a 1% crit buff with their given weapon. So dwarves got a 1% crit boost when using guns. And in BC, this was actually useful, as there were high-level guns that were considered best in slot. Though later on, bows did again take the top spot for ranged weapons. The last change was in 2.4, where Find Treasure no longer deactivated upon death, which was quite a nice small quality of life change. In Wrath of the Lich King, there were two changes to Dwarf's racials. First was a complete revamp of Stone Form, where, in patch 3.1, it no longer made you immune to poisons, disease, and bleed effects, and instead, just cleared any of these effects that you had on you when you cast it. And its cooldown was reduced from 3 minutes down to 2 minutes. This was quite a big change, as now instead of being immune to the effects, you simply cleared them, and they could be reapplied even while you had the Stone Form's 10% armor boost active. But while the effect is weaker, you could now use it more often. So there were trade-offs. And the other change was that the resistance racials were changed to, instead of giving 10 resistance, it now just reduced your chance to be hit by frost spells by 2%. Unlike Wrath, Cataclysm brought a whole bunch of changes to Dwarf's racials. Starting off, dwarves gained mace specialization. This had been in the game since launch, but it had been a human racial until now. At the time it was given to dwarves, it was a +3 to expertise with maces and two-handed maces. This was not the high point of the weapon skill racial, as earlier they gave a +5 expertise. But who would complain about a new racial? Take what you can get. And that wasn't the only new racial dwarves got. Find Treasure was removed. But with the new Archaeology profession added to the game, Find Treasures was replaced with Explorer, which increased your Archaeology skill by 15 and let dwarves use Archaeology survey skill faster, much in the same way that a Tauren could herb faster, and at the time, the newly added Worgen could skin faster. At some point this was changed, however. It still gave the boost to survey speed, but instead of giving the +15 bonus to the profession, it increased the number of Archaeology fragments you gained from each pickup, which was probably for the best, as due to travel times between dig sites, some people have said it takes as long to max out Archaeology as it did to max out fishing, and gaining extra fragments would speed up that process. Resistance racials were also reworked again, reverting a little bit so that Frost Resistance gave Frost Resistance again, but instead of being a flat +10 like it was in vanilla and TBC, it now scaled based on your level, starting off with 1 and going up to 85 at max level. In addition to all this, Stone Form got another change. In patch 4.06, it now, instead of increasing your armor by 10%, it reduced all damage taken by 10%, a rather significant buff. And with this part of Stone Form changed, it was now a completely different ability than the one dwarves originally had back in vanilla, where it used to grant you immunity to a couple of schools of magics and bleeds and a armor increase, and now just a flat damage reduction. Mist of Pandaria had less changes than Cataclysm, but there were also a couple nonetheless. To start off, Frost Resistance was again changed to reduce the damage taken by 1%. Resistances were slowly being phased out of the game, so a 1% damage reduction is better than having a racial completely removed. At the same time, gun specialization was removed and replaced with Crack Shot. They gave you a 1% expertise bonus with all ranged weapons, as during the expansion they thought it was unfair hunters didn't have to use the expertise stat, but all melee physical classes did. So they applied it to them for this one expansion before removing it completely from the game in WoD. Because it turned out, people didn't like the stat at all, as all it did was reduce the chance a target could dodge or parry your attacks. So it was basically a second hit chance stat. And with hunters having to worry about a new stat, this was actually a decent change for dwarf hunters. And now dwarves weren't stuck playing second fiddle to night elves at Alliance, whenever bows were the best in slot weapons. Truly a welcome change, if a short-lived one. Moving on to Warlords of Draenor, all the weapon skill racials were removed, and Crack Shot along with them. Mace specialization was also removed, and at least the dwarves got something to replace their new racial, Might of the Mountain. Might of the Mountain gave dwarves a 2% increase to critical damage and healing, and while it's nothing to write home about, it's still better than nothing. Especially when most classes with weapon skill racials got nothing to compensate for losing those racials. The other big change for dwarves was with Stone Form again. It now removes magic and curse effects in addition to the poisons, disease, bleeds that it always did. The other half of it also changed, so instead of reducing all damage taken by 10% for 8 seconds, it now only reduced physical damage taken. Also, it cannot be used during crowd control effects now. In the first patch of WoD in 6.1, they added on a 30-second shared cooldown with this ability and other PvP trinkets that do break CC effects, despite the fact that the ability could no longer be used to break them. So they kind of buffed and nerfed the ability a little bit, as being able to purge magical effects is really good, but now you can't use it to break CC effects. The final and most recent change to the Dwarves racials came in Legion, as a hotfix early on which made Might of the Mountain appear in the spellbook properly, which was basically just fixing an oversight dwarf bug. And that's it! Since that small hotfix in Legion, nothing has changed for Dwarves and their racials. It ends not with a bang, but with a whimper, but hey, maybe that means the Dwarves racials were actually pretty balanced, and if your racials are balanced, at least it decreases the chance you'll get nerfed. And in the most recent raid, Castle Nathria, the Dwarves Stone racial ability was objectively the best racial, but the reason you didn't see top guilds clearing out an alliance is a topic for another video. In this video, we'll be talking about the various racials of the humans in WoW, from vanilla all the way to Shadowlands. First up, we have Perception, which was an ability added at launch with humans and was the only active racial abilities that the humans had. What it did was, on a 3-minute cooldown, it would increase your stealth detection by 50 points, or 10 levels. It was mostly used for PvP to catch rogues and druids at stealth, before they could open up on you. And for that, it was pretty good at its job. The extra 10 levels of stealth detection counteracted the rogue's Master of Deception talent, which would decrease their chance to be detected in stealth by a similar amount. Next up, we have a 2-for-1 spot with a sword and mace specialization. These both do the exact same thing, but for different weapons. Sword specialization grants you a +5 to your 1- and 2-handed sword skills, giving you, at max level, around an extra 3% chance to hit with swords, and reducing the amount of glancing blows you would deal. And mace specialization does the same thing, just for maces and 2-handed maces. And throughout vanilla, the best weapons for warriors were predominantly swords and maces, making humans both an excellent PvP option, as well as the best option for warriors on the Alliance in general. The fourth human racial is the Human Spirit. This is very simple. It granted a 5% increase to the spirit stat, a good bonus for priests and leveling in general, as spirits sped up your health and mana regeneration. The last of the original human racials is Diplomacy. It gives humans a 10% increase to reputation gains with all factions. And this is the longest lasting unchanged ability that is still in the game today. From the day vanilla launched in 2004 to today, Diplomacy has never been changed in any way. The only other ability to go so long without a change was the Rogue's Cheap Shot ability, which didn't receive a single change until Shadowlands, when they lowered its combo point generation to only 1, down from 2. Later on in vanilla, there were a few changes to the human racials. Perception had its range increased in patch 1.4, and then later in 1.8, they made it so it could be used while in stealth, making human rogues even better, as they now have advantage to finding enemy rogues, as whichever rogue opens up on the other generally wins in a 1v1 situation. In patch 2.3 of the Burning Crusade, all of the weapon skill racials were changed to give a +5 expertise instead of a +5 weapon skills, and this affected mace and sword specialization as well. The Burning Crusade was light on changes for the human racials, but maybe they were just saving up changes, as Wrath of the Lich King had quite a few. In Wrath of the Lich King, humans got a completely new racial in Every Man for Himself. This was basically an extra PvP trinket, because what it did was, on a 2-minute cooldown, it would remove all movement and parry effects and all effects which cause loss of control of your character. This effect shares a cooldown with other similar effects. At the same time this was added, Perception was reduced down to be a passive skill, and now only gave 5 points of stealth detection, or 1 level, but even if they lost out on the stealth detection, an extra trinket effect was really good for PvP. Later on in Wrath, Every Man for Himself was fixed, as it had a bug where sometimes it would disconnect you if you used it while rooted, which is a pretty weird specific bug. During Wrath was the only time when humans had all 6 of their racials at the same time, and it's been all downhill since. In Cataclysm, Perception was removed outright, as its niche as the PvP racial was now filled up by Every Man for Himself, which they seem to find to be too powerful, as they increased its cooldown from 2 minutes up to 3 minutes. Because with the human racial, humans didn't actually need to use the PvP trinket, which could break a CC, which means human players could use 1 more DPS trinket than all other races, giving them a big advantage in PvP. A little while later, in patch 4.06, they reverted the cooldown of Every Man for Himself back down to 2 minutes, and the widely known community manager at the time, Ghostcrawler, said that we believe we over-nerfed it when talking about the ability. Then in patch 4.1, every man for himself saw another change, but this time it was just a new visual effect. And the human spirit had the spirit bonus it granted reduced from 5% down to 3%. And also during Cataclysm, the weapon skills racials had their expertise bonus decreased from a +5 to a +3, bringing the bonus they provided from 1% to just under it at around 0.75%. Also, mace specialization was given to dwarves too at this time, so now 2 different races had this racial. Mist of Pandaria saw no direct changes to any of the human racial abilities, but the expertise stat was modified to also grant spell hit. So as long as you had either an axe or mace equipped in your main hand, you'd get extra expertise and spell hit from the mace or sword specialization. Weirdly though, you didn't get the bonus if the weapon was in your offhand. Not that many casters could even put weapons in their offhand anyway. Warlords of Draenor came with a lot of nerfs for human racials. Sword and mace specialization were removed from the game, and while dwarves got the racial Might of the Mountain to replace mace specialization, which is a 2% bonus to critical strike and healing damage, humans got nothing to compensate for their loss. The human spirit was also completely redesigned to now, instead of giving 3% spirit, it gave a flat amount of versatility that scaled with level. Moving on to Legion, it was another round of nerfs. Every man for himself was altered, so now it only removes stun effects and no longer can be used to remove all movement impairing effects. Though it was partially bugged at launch and still worked like its old version, so a week later into the expansion they fixed it so that you could no longer activate it on abilities that it couldn't actually break. The human racial had dominated as one of the best PvP racials for a while, so this was an effort to curtail human dominance in PvP. The human spirit was also altered so that instead of the flat versatility increase it got in WoD, it now just gives 2% more to all secondary stats, which could probably go either way if you think this is a buff or a nerf. Since Legion, the only thing that's changed about the human racials was every man for himself, which in Battle for Azeroth had its cooldown increased to 3 minutes, and had the shared cooldown with similar effects like the Gladiator's Medallion increased from 30 seconds up to 90 seconds. Then in Shadowlands, it had its name changed from Every Man for Himself to Will to Survive, and removed the part of the tooltip that mentioned the 90-second shared cooldown. With Blizzard trying to make racials less and less important, making them around only a 1% difference between each other, it makes sense that they nerfed all of the racials so heavily, because the human racials were kind of too good. And with that, that's it. History of human racial abilities. Interestingly, with Every Man for Himself having a name change, you could argue they both have the newest racial ability in Will to Survive, even newer than the allied races of BFA, while also having the oldest and longest lasting ability in the game, with Diplomacy. In this video, we're going over the history of orc racials, from when the game first launched in 2004, all the way up to present day in Shadowlands. First up, we have axe specialization. These came out at launch with the orc and made them the best race for horde warriors. And what it did was very simple. It gave you +5 to your axe and two-handed axe skills. You see, back in vanilla WoW, we had weapon skills, where the more you used a certain type of weapon, the higher the chance you had to hit with that weapon type. And in vanilla, these skills maxed out at 300, and some races were able to bring this higher than the maximum to 305. This meant that if you wanted to try to max out your hit cap, you needed 3% less hit chance from the rest of your gear thanks to the +5 in axe specialization. And it also reduced the amount of glancing blows you do, which increased your damage by a fair amount. And fun fact, kind of a side point, despite these things being much more important for physical damage dealing classes, the caster stat Intellect increased the speed at which you increased your weapon skills when you were training them for the first time. Next, we go over to Command. Command is fairly simple in comparison to axe specialization. It just increases the damage of the orc's pets by 5%. This made orcs a top choice for any class that heavily relied on their pets, like hunters and warlocks. Hardiness is the third orc racial, and arguably the best PvP racial that hordes have had access to, and maybe even the strongest PvP racial in the game even to this day. Besides, there could be an argument made for another horde racial, Will of the Forsaken. But we'll go over that in a different video. So, what it did back in vanilla was give the orc an additional 25% chance to resist a stun effect. This was insanely strong, and since vanilla it has been constantly nerfed. But, even in its nerf state, it is still considered one of the best PvP racials. At launch, the ability was a little bit bugged, and a lot of abilities were just ignoring the racial. So in patch 1.5, they fixed it so that it would work properly. And last but not least, we have the most iconic of the orc racials, Blood Fury. The only active racial the orcs got, and what it did, was on a 2-minute cooldown, it increased your strength by 25%, and it dealt 5% of your maximum health as damage to you every 3 seconds, and the ability lasted for 20 seconds. This was later revised in patch 1.4 to increase your melee attack power by 25% for 15 seconds, where it would then decrease your attack power by 25% for 45 seconds afterwards. This allowed classes like rogues and shamans to benefit much more from it, since it no longer just increased strength. Finally, in patch 1.9, the hefty 25% melee attack power decrease was changed to be a 50% healing taken reduction instead. That way it was a pure DPS boost and no longer had a DPS downside to it. Throughout vanilla, it was really only used by warriors, rogues, and enhancement shamans, as it did nothing for casters or hunters that weren't stuck on nightfall duty. Moving on to the Burning Crusade, pre-patch hardiness was nerfed down to 15% additional stun resistance, and I don't need to tell you again that this was still an S tier racial. At the same time, Blood Fury was changed to give attack power for hunters, as well as spell damage for casters. And also, instead of being a flat 25%, it was a scaled value that increased with level. At level 1, it would give you 6 melee attack power and casters 5 spell damage, scaling up to 212 melee attack power, and 143 spell damage at level 70. For hunters, it just gave attack power rather than melee attack power, and shamans actually got both the melee attack power and the spell damage. In patch 2.3, all of the weapon skill racials of all the various different races were changed from their +5 weapon skill to 1% crit for ranged weapons and 1% expertise for the melee weapons. Much like hit chance in Vanilla WoW, you need a certain percentage to hit your expertise cap to maximize your chance to hit your targets and avoid the chance to hit with glancing blows. Basically, glancing blows are when your basic melee attacks just do less damage than they would normally. As for command, it remained unchanged throughout this expansion. Moving on to Wrath of the Lich King, the healing reduction debuff from Blood Fury was removed, and at the same time, hardiness was reworked to make it so that instead of granting you 15% additional stun resistance, it just decreases durations of stuns on you by 15%. Decreasing the duration of a stun is much less impactful than resisting the full stun altogether, but it's more consistent and doesn't rely on RNG, so it was still good after the change, and maybe just a bit less so. Also, in very early Wrath, Blood Fury was just taken off the global cooldown. Then in patch 3.1, with Blizzard remembering that the Death Knight class was added to the game, Command was extended to cover their pets as well as Shaman pets. And then in patch 3.2, Fist weapons were added into the weapons affected by Axe specialization. So now Orcs could get the expertise buff on Fist weapons too. In Cataclysm, the only racial change was in patch 4.3, where Blood Fury was changed again so that instead of spell damage for casters, it gave them spell power. As in Wrath of the Lich King, a lot of the items that had spell damage were just converted into spell power, making this racial one of the last spell damage holdouts. Cataclysm then removed spell power from armor, leaving it only to weapons, trinkets, and jewelry. In Mist of Pandaria pre-patch, monks were added to the game, and like shamans, they gained both the melee attack power and spell power buff from Blood Fury. Additionally, command was nerfed from 5% down to 2%. In Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard changed a number of stats in the game. This caused many of the racials to be changed as well to balance everything. Most of this came out with the pre-patch where expertise and hit stats were removed, heralding the death of axe specialization and all the other weapon specialization racials as well. Command was nerfed again, reduced from 2% damage increase to only 1%, where it has remained ever since. Hardiness, which had remained the same since Wrath of the Lich King, was nerfed from its 15% stun duration down to only 10%. This didn't last long though, as in the very next hotfix, in patch 6.03, this change was reversed, bringing it back up to 15% it had always been for the past 3 expansions. Later on in patch 6.2.2, it was buffed even further to the 20% we now love today, once again firmly planting itself as the best all-around horde PvP racial in the game. Arguably, of course. In the Battle for Azeroth pre-patch, Blood Fury again was the last holdout, as Blizzard had removed the spell power stat early on in Legion, rolling its effect into Intellect. So in the BFA pre-patch, Blood Fury was brought in line with that, giving Intellect instead of spell power, as well as finally correcting the tooltip to attack power instead of melee attack power. And ever since then, there hasn't been any significant changes to any of the racials. In this video, we'll be going over the history of the racial abilities of our favorite cow friends, the Tauren. The first animal race in WoW, the Tauren's most iconic racial is War Stomp. War Stomp is an AoE stun effect with a half-second cast time and a 2-minute cooldown. The stun lasts for 2 seconds and can hit up to 5 targets within 8 yards. This has pretty much always been useful in PvP and many PvE situations throughout all of WoW's history. Next up we have Endurance. This was super simple and gave the Tauren a 5% increase to their total health. With this, a Tauren tank had slightly more health than any other tank, but it wasn't as significant as it might sound. Next up we have Cultivation, which increased the Herbalism skill of Tauren by 15. Super simple. Lastly, we have the Resistance racial and Nature Resistance. This provided a flat plus 10 to the Tauren's Nature Resistance stat, which, like all racial resistance stats, was pretty niche in its usefulness. Another small thing I wanted to mention here is that back in Vanilla WoW, Tauren had bigger hitboxes than other races. Male Tauren specifically had the biggest hitbox of any playable race in the game. This also gave them the longest melee range. So come the Burning Crusade with the introduction of arenas, some players in PvP were able to hit their opponents on the opposite side of a pillar, giving them an even greater advantage as a warrior in PvP. And just like the gnome's ability to tame mechanical pets, this was kind of a secret or a hidden racial. During all of the beta for the original WoW, the Tauren also had a racial running speed called Plains Running, which basically let them run at mount speed after they were running for 10 seconds uninterrupted, as originally Tauren were seen as too heavy for mounts, so this was supposed to be the replacement. But it was really overall just god-awful, because you'd lose the run speed if you entered combat, and normal mounts could run through mobs as long as they weren't dazed. So, it took longer to get to mount speed and was less useful than a normal mount, and it was scrapped, as they were afraid any buffs to the ability might make it overpowered. So it was removed at the last second before the launch and replaced with, of course, the Kodo mount, and was even mentioned in the instruction manual that came with the game as a feature that Taurens had, and could use, even though they never could in the live version of the game. There were no changes to Tauren racials in the Burning Crusade, so we'll just slide right past that and move on to Wrath of the Lich King, where the only change was to Nature Resistance, which was modified to now have a 2% reduced chance to be hit by nature spells instead of a plus 10 resistance to it. This wasn't anything special, all resistance racials got a similar change. It was also during Wrath that the hidden racial we mentioned earlier was removed due to just how powerful it was in Arena throughout TBC. Hitboxes were normalized, so the gnomes and Taurens didn't have vastly different melee attack ranges. The Cultivation racial didn't change here, but the Gathering professions each got a special ability. Herbalists got the ability Lifeblood, a small heal over time that was pretty good, but there was an interesting interaction between Cultivation and Lifeblood, in that Tauren had to get 15 more skill in Herbalism than anyone else in order to reach the next rank of Lifeblood. A strange little interaction due to the increase in skill that Cultivation gave them. Moving on to the Cataclysm, resistance racials were changed again to now give a scaling amount of resistance to your racial stat based on your level. So at level 1, a Tauren would have 1 nature resistance, and at level 85, they would have 85 nature resistance. Warstomp was modified to now be able to work while shapeshifted, increasing the strength of Tauren druids by a fair margin. Cultivation also got an update as Worgen got a racial called Flayer, which, in addition to increasing their skinning skill by 15, it also increased their skinning speed. So in an effort to keep parity, this increased gathering speed was added to Cultivation as well, bringing the gathering time down from 2 seconds to half a second. And while later expansions added enchantments that allowed other races to get the same benefit, for the time being, the Tauren was the fastest herb gatherer. It is also worth noting here that Tauren can be druids, and druids are still the most proficient gatherers, as they can stealth past mobs in cat form and dash away if enemies are coming at you, as well as root them so they can't interrupt your gathering. They can even gather in flight form, so they don't actually have to land or dismount to gather from nodes. So a Tauren druid is the best gathering tool you can really have. Worgen would be up there with skinning, but that requires you to kill a mob first. So even though they can be druids, they have to land and fight to take advantage of their racial. Mists of Pandaria saw the final redesign of resistance racials to date, as the resistance stat was removed. The racials now provide a flat 1% reduced damage from that school of magic. The last expansions were very light on racial changes, but with Warlords of Draenor, everything was rebalanced. First off, Endurance was modified to now give a scaling amount of stamina in place of the 5% health boost from before. And just like the resistance racial of Cataclysm, it increased your stamina by a flat amount as you leveled up. Then a new racial was added to the Tauren in the form of Brawn. This increased the critical strike bonus damage and healing by 2%. This doesn't increase your critical strike chance, but rather it increases the power of your crits. So when a Tauren crits with either an attack or a heal, it's just 2% stronger. This was added in an effort to better balance the racials for competitive content, as Taurens were one of the few races with no real DPS increase from a racial. A bit later on in the expansion in patch 6.2, the cooldown of Warstomp was reduced from 2 minutes down to 1.5 minutes. Another welcome change, But on top of that, they also made the ability immune to pushback. Even though it had a very short cast time of half a second, the push time on it could sometimes make it take over a second to cast. Lastly, we have Legion, and the last time the Tauren racials have changed as of Shadowlands. And the only change was a hotfix that ensured that the Tauren's brawn appeared correctly in the spellbook, as there seems to have been issues where it wasn't actually showing up. As the Tauren racials have remained stagnant since Legion, let's shift gears a bit and look at the racials of the Highmountain Tauren, as they were made a playable race for the Horde in patch 7.3.5, and hold the honor of being one of the first allied races added to the game. Starting off, we have Bull Rush. This is an active ability that lets the Highmountain charge at a target, knocking down enemies. It has about a 20-yard range and a 2-minute cooldown. The charge lasts for 1 second, and the knockdown lasts for 1.5 seconds. This functions much like War Stomp, however, instead being a focus on a forward line instead of a circular AoE, even acting almost as a movement ability too, as you run faster and it doesn't require a target to use. And also, like War Stomp, it can be used in Druid forms, meaning, for example, in Cat form, this charge sends you even faster, as it does stack with some speed buffs. Next up, we have Pride of the Ironhorn, which functions exactly like the normal Tauren's cultivation, except for mining rather than herbalism. It increases mining skill by 15 and decreases the gathering time quite considerably. By this point in time, the glove enchantments to increase gathering speed for other races have been added to the game, so it's not as special as it once was. Mountaineer is the next racial, and all it does is provide a flat 1% increase to the Highmountain's versatility. Pretty boring, but every race needs at least one boring racial to go with the fun ones. Waste Not, Want Not is one of the more interesting racials in the Highmountain list. It's a passive ability that gives you a chance to loot additional meat and fish. While it doesn't do anything for your combat power, it's a fun flavor thing, as the Tauren species overall can be described as hunter-gatherers. The Highmountain Tauren are far more connected to the hunter, while the regular Tauren are more connected to gatherer. Lastly, we have Rugged Tenacity, the strongest racial for Highmountain by far. What it does is reduce damage taken by 1.8% of your stamina. This is the Highmountain's answer to the Tauren's endurance. While the Tauren focus on increasing their health with stamina, the Highmountain focus on reducing the damage to their health with stamina. Think of it like this: for every 1000 stamina you have, you take 18 less damage from each attack. Unlike magic resistance racials, which decrease damage taken from a school by a static 1%, this reduces the damage by a scaling amount and works on every damage type. And this was especially good on tanks, who commonly get lots of stamina. While this isn't the strongest racial ever, it is certainly the best from a power standpoint for the Highmountain Tauren. Although sadly in Battle for Azeroth it was nerfed a fair bit to now only give 0.6% of stamina, down from 1.8% in Legion. In this video we're going over the history of the racial abilities of the Trolls. We will start off strong with one of the best racials in the history of the game, Berserking. It went through a lot of changes over the course of vanilla. It started off as given a fixed increase to attack and casting speed, but could only be triggered while under 20% health and had a 2-minute cooldown. In patch 1.22, it had a minor bug fix, as shamans were able to use it even while not below 20% health for some reason. Shortly later in patch 1.4, it was reworked, where it now increased attack and casting speed by 25%, but it increased your damage taken by 10%, and instead of only being usable below 20% health, it could only be used after you were critically hit. Although in the very next patch, it was clarified in the tooltip that they meant melee critical hit. Finally, in patch 1.9, it was reworked again to what we all recognize it as in Classic, costing either a bit of mana, energy, or rage, whatever you had it. It was also raised to a 3-minute cooldown from 2 minutes to fit with its missing health theme. It now increased your attack and casting speed by 10 to 30% based on how much health you were missing for 10 seconds. This change also took it off the global cooldown, allowing you to macro in with your other DPS cooldowns, making it quite a powerful racial. During vanilla, most of the higher end players were on the Alliance, but through the years on private servers, this ability was theory crafted to perfection, where in PvE, trolls would take off all their gear to decrease their maximum HP, then put it all on right as the fight was about to start, and because your health wouldn't automatically increase when gear was put on, they would then pop the Berserking right as the fight started to get more value out of Berserking, and maybe even get a second use of it depending on the length of the fight, although this may really anger your healers. These days, the classic community speedruns raids, so some fights don't even last 1 minute, let alone 3. But this is still a fun interaction. Moving on, we have Regeneration, which was very good back in the day. It gave you a 10% to your health regen in combat, while also overall increasing your health regeneration by the same amount. The best PvP use of this is rogues who can vanish to gain a bit of time to get some health back while their enemy sits stunned. but in PvE it is quite a nice little heal to ease the burden on your healers, even if the heal overall was incredibly minor. It is also fantastic for questing, as back in vanilla, health regen was really low. So slow that melee classes often needed to eat food every 2 to 3 pulls. That meant this extra generation allowed trolls to level faster than others, and while it was only 10%, it does add up quick over the time it takes to level. Funny enough, the racial was thought of as useless originally in vanilla WoW, and its value wasn't really gleaned until Classic developed a meta. Next up we have the Beast Layer, and this also helped increase leveling speed slightly. What it did was increase the damage the troll dealt to beasts by 5%. Although there are not many beast mobs in endgame content vanilla, it did at least have some uses in AQ, Nax, Molten Core, and a ton of uses in ZG at least. Lastly, we have throwing and bow specialization, which increased the troll's throwing and bow skills by 5 respectively. Like other weapon racial skills, these made your attacks with the chosen weapon less likely to miss. And while throwing weapons were more of a minor thing, almost all the best endgame weapons for hunters were bows. This made trolls the best hunters for horde and PvE content, in addition to trolls having the highest space agility out of the horde races, and second only to night elves as a whole. There is only one change to troll racials in the Burning Crusade, that being a rework of all weapon skill racials. This included throwing and bow specialization. Range skills like these were changed from a +5 weapon skill to a 1% crit increase while using the weapons. Meanwhile, melee weapons were changed to just give some bonus expertise. Wrath of the Lich King saw a few more changes than what the Burning Crusade provided. First off, a new racial was added to the trolls called the Voodoo Shuffle. It passively decreased the duration of all movement and parrying effects by 15%. This worked on roots and snares, but oddly enough not stuns, as those remain the domain of the orcs with their hardiness racial. Berserking also saw a couple of changes in the expansion. First, in patch 3.2, it was changed so that instead of giving scaling, attack, and casting speed buff based on missing health, it gave a flat 20% to attack and casting speed instead. Although yet again, the tooltip for it was incorrect, so in the next patch they fixed it to show its proper effect once again. The Cataclysm saw no changes to the troll racials, so let's move on to the following expansion, Mist of Pandaria, which had 2. First off, we had the removal of throwing weapon specialization. Obviously, as Pandaria was the expansion when thrown weapons were removed entirely from the game. Bow specialization was also replaced, but at least it still existed in some sense, being renamed to Deadeye, a version which now gave trolls expertise with guns, bows, and crossbows by 1%. Now onto Warlords of Draenor, there were actually quite a number of changes to racials. First off, Deadeye was removed as a weapon skill, as hit and expertise were removed from the game, and with these changes, Blizzard no longer wanted to lock certain specific races into specific weapon types. Beast Slaying was changed so that instead of increasing damage to beasts by 5%, it now increased experience gained from killing beasts by 20%, which may be a slight blow to their damage output, but it now at least directly increases their leveling speed, and made leveling in beast-heavy areas faster. Berserking was also changed to now give 15% haste down from 20%. It is now also called haste instead of attack and casting speed, although it has pretty much the same effect. And followed by patch 6.2, the Voodoo Shuffle was buffed by 5%, now reducing the duration of movement and parrying effects by 20% rather than 15%. And the troll racials have not really changed much since BFA. However, what did happen in Battle for Azeroth was the troll racials actually played a very important part for the race to world first on Jaina. You see, Jaina had an ability in the fight called Chilling Touch, which she would stack on the whole raid with a number of abilities, and if it ever got to 20 stacks, then the player would be frozen solid and have to be DPS'd out by the other players. The way to manage this was by using flame barrels and by triggering the freeze at times when the raid could break you out together. However, the stacks technically counted as a snare, so the racial Voodoo Shuffle would lower its duration by 20%, which meant troll players had the option to just let the stacks fall off by expiring. This obviously wasn't supposed to be an option for managing the stacks, but it made parts of the fight so much easier that top guilds paid for their entire raid team to race change to trolls just to deal with the Chilling Touch mechanic easier, leading to a world first kill by method, which thankfully was an option available to both factions as alliance were transformed into horde for this fight. Later on, Blizzard changed this so trolls couldn't gain this advantage anymore, and since then there haven't been any real changes to troll racial since. However, going back to BFA quick, with patch 8.1.5, the Zandalari trolls were added to the growing list of allied races, and while the racials have not seen any adjustments, they were added to the game as the troll allied race, so we'll cover them here now, as they have not been around long enough to get their own video. First off, they have City of Gold. This is a passive ability that gives the Zandalari 2% more gold when they loot anything. Super simple and rather nice too. There's even an add-on to see how much extra gold you get when looting mobs. Next up, we have the Pterodactyl Swoop, which on a 15-minute cooldown gives you the effect of the Goblin Glider with the Pterodactyl visual, which slows your fall and lasts for 2 minutes while flying you forward. Next, we move on to the combat racials. First, we have Embrace of the Loa. To understand this, it requires a bit of background. Trolls as a whole worship these beings called Loa, and by doing so, they're granted boons, including the Zandalari Troll, which have various shrines to various Loas within Zuldazar, their major city. This racial allows the Zandalari to interact with these shrines and receive a permanent minor buff, although you can only have one. The buff you get depends on which shrine you interact with Akunda giving healing spells additional healing, Bomsamdi giving damage abilities bonus shadow damage that heals for the bonus shadow damage dealt, Gonk increasing movement speed by 5%, Kimball giving your damaging abilities a chance to cause your target to bleed for 6 seconds, stacking 3 times, Kragwa, which causes your max health and armor to increase upon taking damage, and Paku, which gives your damaging abilities a chance to increase your crit by 4% for 12 seconds. Yes, quite a lot of Loa, and for sure the coolest, most in-depth and customizable racial we've ever seen. While also being the ability with the longest cooldown in the game currently with a 5-day cooldown, and basically allows Zandalari players to choose which racial stat bonus they want. Lastly, we have Regeneratin, which is arguably the strongest Zandalari racial. What it does is, on a 2.5 minute cooldown, you channel for 6 seconds and regain 100% of your health. This can be interrupted by damage at least, however paladins who get low on it can pop a divine shield, and then use this to get back to full health uninterrupted before resuming the fight. On the PTR before it went live, this ability was going to be a 4-second channel that could not be interrupted by damage, meaning it could only be stopped with some sort of CC, and with only a 1.5 minute cooldown, which was so broken that the player base and Blizzard agreed upon nerfing it, leading to the 6-second channel with a 2.5 minute cooldown and breaking on any form of damage. In this video, we'll be talking about the history of the racial abilities of the Undead, from back when Sylvanas' model was still a night elf, all the way up until she left the Horde because they couldn't appreciate her greatness. Starting off way back in the early days of vanilla, the Undead had 4 racial abilities, the first of which is Underwater Breathing, which was pretty simple. It increased your underwater breathing time by 300%. Back in vanilla, the breath you had while underwater was much shorter than it is today. So when you only had about 60 seconds underwater, it was quite helpful for the Undead to be able to be underwater for 3 minutes rather than 1. At endgame, this wasn't a very big deal, but there are a number of underwater quests that you can run into while leveling, which it's quite helpful for. And remember everyone, Classic WoW was designed with leveling being the main focus of the game, not endgame. That's a future thing that happened. The next of the racials is Shadow Resistance. This was quite simple and just increase your resistance to shadow damage by 10. The third racial they got was Cannibalism. What it did was allow you to consume a nearby humanoid or undead corpse to regain 7% of your maximum health over 10 seconds. Much like underwater breathing, not too impactful at endgame, though it could have some niche uses in PvP. But it was a channeled ability and had a thing where if you took any damage it would cancel it. And with a 2-minute cooldown, you'd best make sure you don't have any dots on you before you triggered it. The final racial is the one you've all been waiting for, which is the Will of the Forsaken. This ability was added to Forsaken at launch, when Forsaken got a type change from Undead to Humanoid classification, so that they could kind of mimic the CC immunities they used to enjoy with that type distinction. At launch, what this did was give you immunity to Charm, Fear, and Sleep effects when active. It could also be used while you were afflicted by fears or sleep effects to clear them, and this immunity lasted 20 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. Despite it being super strong, it actually didn't work properly, as until patch 1.2, it could not actually be used during fears. But then in 1.6, it got a significant nerf, taking its duration from 20 seconds down to 5 seconds, bringing it down from incredibly overpowered to just being really good. And while orcs were still favored by many for PvP, Undead were able to come within striking distance of orcs when it came to PvP effectiveness. Way later on in patch 1.12, it was fixed so that it could be activated during charm effects as well. But with this change, it had finally settled mostly into how it would act throughout the history of the game, though there were still a few changes coming to it further down the line. These changes wouldn't happen until Wrath of the Lich King, however, as there were no changes to the Undead racials throughout the entirety of the Burning Crusade. But aside from cannibalism, all the Undead racials got at least minor changes in Wrath. At launch, the breath mechanic underwater was changed, so now everyone got 3 minutes like the Undead used to. So with that, the racial was decreased down to 233% from its former 300%. It now effectively gave you 10 minutes of underwater breathing. As with the other resistance racials, shadow resistance was reworked as well. Instead of the base 10 shadow resistance, it now reduced the chance you would be hit by shadow spells by a flat 2%. Then, later on in patch 3.3, Will of the Forsaken was given a 45-second shared cooldown with PvP trinkets, like the medallions and insignias of the day, so you could no longer pop yourself out of a crowd control with a trinket, and then when the enemy CCs you again, hit Will of the Forsaken right after. You'd have to wait 45 seconds after using the trinket or vice versa. Before this change, Will of the Forsaken was considered a more limited version of the human racial, every man for himself, but at least it didn't pop your PvP trinket on cooldown, so it was still useful. After the change, it was just a weaker version of the human racial. The Cataclysm also saw changes to 3 of the 4 racials, but this time it was underwater breathing that remained untouched. To start us off, the resistance racials were changed again. So instead of the 2% chance to be hit by shadow spells reduction, it now gave you a straight increase to your resistance stat. But instead of the flat 10 from the early days, it was 1 at level 1 and scaled all the way up to 85 at max level. Basically, your shadow resistance increased by 1 every time you leveled up. Will of the Forsaken had the cooldown it shares with PvP trinkets decreased from 45 seconds to 30. A little later on in patch 4.03, Cannibalism was changed again to now give mana as well as health when consuming a corpse. And it also had the flat percentage of each tick increased to around 8 to 9% from 7%, though this was later reverted. Mist of Pandaria was another large set of changes to the undead. To start off, underwater breathing was removed and replaced with Touch of the Grave. Touch of the Grave added a passive leech effect to an undead's attacks, where every time you attacked or cast a spell, you had a chance to do an extra bit of shadow damage, and then heal yourself for as much as the damage that it did. This had around a 20% proc rate on each attack, and while not the biggest deal in the world, it was a nice little effect for endgame, unlike underwater breathing, which was much more for leveling. Shadow resistance was changed again, as resistance again was reworked and the resistance stats was removed, so that now instead of getting a scaling increase to your resistance stat, you got a flat 1% reduction to all shadow damage taken. This was the final change that shadow resistance has received as of Shadowlands, and while not a big and interesting racial even today, it is a nice little bit of flavor for the race. The most recent set of changes to the undead racials came in Warlords of Draenei, the first being the stat squish. Touch of the Grave had its damage values reduced and had underwater breathing added into it so that now undead can breathe underwater indefinitely. So when underwater, undeads just don't have any breath bar at all anymore. Will of the Forsaken also had its base cooldown increased to 3 minutes, up from 2, but very quickly reduced back to 2 minutes in a hotfix soon after. Touch of the Grave did go through some other changes, though in patch 6.2.2, it now scaled based on 50% of the player's attack or spell power, whichever is greater. And then a couple months later in a hotfix, it had its damage increased by 100%. And that's it. For the last 3 expansions, nothing else has changed with the undead racial abilities, unlike many of the other original races who went through a plethora of changes. Maybe that means they have stagnated, or maybe with Kalia returning and Sylvanas' departure at the end of BFA, they are waiting to completely redo them later on in the Shadowlands or the expansion following. There's a lot of story potential for the undead right now, and we'll just have to wait and see. In today's history video, we're going to be talking about professions that were added in later expansions, and what new and unique things these professions added to the game. The first post-launch profession was Jewelcrafting. Added with the Burning Crusade, it added a fair few new mechanics to the game. First, we'll start with gems. They added cut gems. Unlike the gems used for generic crafting in vanilla, these cut gems came with specific primary or secondary stats and were obtained by 5 or more ore to prospect it, gaining some uncut gems in the process. Second, we had gem slots. This is what the gems went into. Items that had gem slots had anywhere from 1 to 4 slots, and these slots had various different colors. How these slots worked is they basically just replace stats on a piece of gear, allowing you to somewhat customize that gear. While any gem could be placed in these slots, gear with gems in them also gave a gem bonus, which was usually a small bonus that would sometimes activate if the gems were filled properly. And well, how did you fill them out properly? By putting the proper color in. Of course, the primary color, and also any secondary color that contained that color activated it. For example, a socket which requires a red gem for its socket bonus could be fulfilled by simply placing a red gem in it. And it could be fulfilled by placing an orange and purple gem in it as well. You see, the purple, green, and orange gems were half colors, and each one could fulfill the full requirements for any 2 gem colors. And the way you could remember which half colors worked on which primary colors was simply by knowing which 2 colors mixed to make those colors. So while you could place whatever gem color you wanted in the slots, if you put the same color in all the slots, you got a bonus. So for example, let's go over the item Light Mantle of the Incarnate, which had a red socket and blue socket, which if both filled gave 4 extra stamina. There were also a few other things. First, the meta socket. These sockets were only in helmets, and they matched with meta gems, which was another special kind of gem that could only be placed in this slot. Meta gems were very powerful gems that had effects like Spell Reflect, chance to stun on hit, less threat generation, increased crit damage, stun resist, etc, etc. However, to unlock this special bonus, you needed a special requirement of other gems in your gear. For example, at least 5 blue gems in your gear, or having more red gems equipped than yellow gems, or at least 3 red and 2 blue. They were kind of weird and random. There was also the prismatic gems and the prismatic sockets, and unlike all the other gems so far, these didn't really have anything to do with each other. Prismatic gems were gems that filled the color role for any slot. Think of it like a rainbow energy, but the only stat available for prismatic gems at first was spell resistance, later changed to have prismatic gems give the +10 to all stats buff, but could only have 1 gem total of that one in your equipment. And the prismatic socket was mainly added to belts using the blacksmithing craft called belt buckles, and these basically just acted as an extra spot to put any gem you wanted in, as they didn't add a gem slot bonus or count towards any existing ones. And fun fact, belt buckles were the most profitable crafting item you could sell in the auction house, as they were relatively easy to make and in such high demand that it was almost impossible to keep a stock or control the market on the auction house of these items. Turns out, adding an extra gem slot is just that good, which is why Blizzard makes you jump through hoops to get similar levels of items in modern WoW, like farming 7,000 Stygia for a gem slot in Shadowlands, a task which can take a full week of dailies. So what jewel crafters did was get gems for ore, then cut them into gems for other players to put in their gear. They also introduced craftable jewelry into the game with necks and rings, which were not craftable before this. Our next profession that was added in the following expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, is Inscription. Like jewel crafting, you would need another gathering profession material, this time Herbalism, to cast Milling on, which consumed 5 herbs a pop in order to give you pigments, which you can then use to make inks. Inscription also added a couple of staple things. First off, the Darkmoon cards, which before this were random drops, now crafted, and are almost always the best entry-level trinkets you can buy at the start of a new expansion, or for a brand new max level alt. In fact, in some expansions, the Darkmoon trinkets were BIS all the way until the final raid tier. And the big thing that got added with Inscription is glyphs, which came in 2 types, major and minor. While minor had, minor effects with things like minor range increases or mana cost reductions on utility spells or new appearances, a couple of examples being reducing the size of your pet or increasing the swim speed of aquatic form and undead breathing, only a handful of minor glyphs actually gave a good DPS boost, and those were usually nerfed, like the Glyph of Corpse Explosion. The real big ones were the major glyphs, which had major buffs. These buffed your spells in actual good capacity, buffing an ability right out, giving a dotted initial burst of damage, or even adding new abilities. These glyphs acted like gems, consumed on use when you socket them into your slots, and then their own tab in the talent screen, staying there until they were replaced. Then with the Cataclysm, we got prime glyphs, which like minor and major had 3 slots, and really were just a place where the most powerful new old major glyphs were moved to give room for more glyphs. Those were also learned like spells instead of being consumed to socket them like in the past. You would consume them to learn them, adding them to a list that you can then use anytime, almost exactly like the essence system of BFA, even in the UI. In the gold making community, this event of glyphs becoming permanent at Cataclysm's launch was known as Glyphmas because of the millions of gold all scribes made from everyone rushing to fill out their glyph collection as fast as possible, back when millions of gold was still a lot of money. Cataclysm also added the first ever and only ever new secondary profession, Archaeology. This profession had players exploring the world and collecting artifacts relevant to the location. Looking for dig sites on your map, you would make your way there and then just walk around finding up and digging fragments, then use those in order to craft random artifacts. This profession was pretty limited, giving greys that sold at varying amount, pets, toys, and a couple of unique mounts, like the Aquamarine Battle Tank, the only way to use a Silithid mount outside of AQ40 without having the Black Scarab mount, with even some gear on rare occasions, like Zinrock Destroyer Worlds, which was a pretty good sword at the time. You could even get the recipe for the Shifting Sandstone Drake, a flying 2-person mount. The last thing was an Archaeology dungeon bonus. See, dungeons and cataclysms were made harder than the Lich King counterparts, and a way to try to make them easier was there was a statue near the start of each cataclysm dungeon, and these statues could be activated by an archaeologist using keystones they found during their work, to gain a buff for the rest of the dungeon, making them a little bit easier, although this was dropped off instantly and was never used again, even in the same expansion's later dungeons. Well, unless you count the Shadowlands Covenant buffs in dungeons as a spiritual successor, Archaeology was interesting, with cool rewards at best. It was also boring, repetitive, and useless at worst, as once you completed all the new rare finds, you were essentially done with the profession for that expansion. Then in Mists of Pandaria, prime glyphs were removed, which was a pretty fast backtrack on the idea. Although to make up for it, Inscription could now craft staves and offhands, something they couldn't craft before. Nothing else really changed in Mists of Pandaria. However, in Warlords of Draenor, we had a pretty big change. They moved some glyphs from Inscription to the default class, by making them learned while leveling up. This way you could at least have a full glyph slots without having to go to the auction house, since glyphs were basically the only system of power that could impact your class and rotation in a very significant way that required purchases through the auction house. Then in Legion, glyphs were pretty heavily reworked. All major glyphs were right out removed, as well as the glyph UI. Now glyphs only came in their minor variety, and were either cosmetics, like changing spell effects or pet appearances, and only ever impacted DPS if they unintentionally bugged out, like the glyph for Demo Warlocks that changed their Felguard into a different demon that was a dual wielder instead of a single weapon user, and slightly increased the pet's DPS in some situations because of how the dual wielding mechanics work. Jewelcrafting never really got anything unique or new added to the profession. However, there are a few things to mention. First off, in Mists of Pandaria, we got a legendary gem that could fit into shot-touched weapons from the first raid tier. We got an item that let us put a prismatic socket onto a weapon from the first 2 raid tiers, and we got a special legendary meta gem that could proc effects like a mini bloodlust. But these have nothing to do with the actual jewel crafting. And then with Legion, colored sockets and socket bonuses were just removed. Now all gear had prismatic sockets, and they made gem sockets far more rare. It was a bonus to have them, not a normal thing on equipment anymore. This really made gem sockets a pick-your-own bonus stat section, and kind of ended jewelcrafting's reign as one of the most profitable professions in the process of making gem slots no longer guaranteed. Archaeology also never really got anything new added to it. Much of the same, with no new big things other than new pristine version solves added in Mists of Pandaria, and used each expansion afterwards. That acted as like a special solve that could only happen once, and gave you an achievement if you collected them all, as well as being able to crate items you find to buy little goodies with them. This was really not that special. Although in the Legion expansion they made it even less special by removing the rare finds from digging, and instead made it a bi-weekly quest that would appear to do a quest chain of archaeology themed stuff, to eventually get what would normally be a rare artifact found. Sadly, as most of the community disliked the profession, it got abandoned in Shadowlands. While not right out removed, it got nothing new with the expansion. No new levels, no new items, leaving it dead in the water, although in-game conversations have hinted at a possible return in future patches. Blizzard did a full shift in professions, going from adding a new one every expansion up to Cataclysm, to even removing one of them in BFA with First Aid being merged into Tailoring. It seems Blizzard had originally wanted to add a new profession with each expansion, like they did a new race or class, but gave up on the idea come Mists of Pandaria, and then started moving player powers out of professions altogether. As you may have guessed from the title and thumbnail, in this video we'll be talking about the fishing profession in WoW. Probably the developer's favorite profession with all the love and care it's received over the years in comparison to every other profession. Fishing has been around since WoW's initial release back in 2004. And throughout the years, while the minigame itself hasn't changed much, the things you can do with fishing has ranged widely. Fishing is the profession that almost never was. In the WoW Diary, a journal of computer game development, they talked about how they were worried that bots would take advantage of the profession to print money. This is the reason why they created the fishing minigame that's in the game to this day, where you cast the line, then wait and click the bobber when the fish is hooked. Back in vanilla, this cast was 30 seconds long, and sometimes you would just not hook a fish at all. The fish were divided up by level brackets with 2 to 3 fish being available in each zone, The fish were then further split up between ocean and freshwater fish depending on what body of water you were fishing in. And you would have a different pool of fish you could fish up. There were also special versions of these fish, and some were white offhands that had their weight in their name, like the 103-pound mite fish or the 15-pound mud snapper. Others were bloated and functioned like a box, which when opened contained some gems, or if you're really lucky, maybe even a ring or necklace, like the famous The One Ring, which gave a +1 to all stats and was a pretty direct reference to Lord of the Rings. Now, in patch 1.2, Blizzard reduced the vendor price of fish, as well as the chance to fish up green items. They also added a minimum level requirement to learn the profession. All of these changes were to further decrease the interest that botters might have in the profession, and to curtail people parking low-level alts in high-level zones to just fish there. The next big change was the addition of the Stranglethorn Fishing Extravaganza in patch 1.7, where for a short period every Sunday afternoon at server time, a fishing contest would begin. Hordes of schools of tasty fish would populate Stranglethorn Vale, and the first person to fish up 40 and return to the NPC would win. There were some side prizes as well for 3 rare fish. The grand prize winner got their pick of a special fishing pole, the Arcanite fishing pole, an on-use item that turned you into a fish, increasing your swim speed, or a fishing line that when attached to your pole gave you a +5 to the skill. Depending on which of the 3 rare fish you caught, you would either get a hat, some boots, or the same fishing line you can get from the grand prize. Each of these items would give you a +5 to fishing skill, just in different item slots. Now, to actually level up fishing, trainers only taught the first skill ranks, those being apprentice and journeyman. Like the other secondary school professions, you had to go out into the world in order to get a book to learn expert and do a quest to learn artisan. The quests were given by Nat Pagel in Dustwalla Marsh, who was named after Pat Nagel, one of the senior quest designers for WoW, who was first hired on Blizzard all the way back in 1997 along with Jeff Kaplan. The quest sends you out into the world to fish up 4 special fish that you can only catch while on this quest and then return to him, at which point you learn artisan fishing, allowing you to learn up to 300 fishing. You needed to have already maxed out your expert fishing skill 225 fish before beginning the quest, and there was a breadcrumb quest from the fishing trainers in Therebor and Orgrimmar for the Alliance and Horde respectively, just like the quest for artisan first aid, and if you haven't seen my video on the history of first aid, you should check that out too. I'll leave it in the video description. Moving on to the Burning Crusade, we got the fishing dailies for the first time. The NPC, Old Man Barlow, just outside Shatrath, has a pool of quests that he rotates through and can be done once a day and rewards you with a bag of fishing treasures, which could contain anything from junk grays to an elixir of water walking, a little crocodile pet, or the weather-beaten fishing hat. Much like the fishing hat before it gave a +5 fishing skill, but unlike the lucky fishing hat, it also had an on-use effect where you could attach a +75 skill lure to your currently equipped rod. This +75 was not as good as the sharpened fishing hook or the aqua dynamic fish attractor, both of which increase your fishing skill by 100, but this one didn't cost you anything. The bag of fishing treasures also had a chance to give you some quality white gear items, like the Noble's Monocle or the antique silver cufflinks, which you can often find in people's bank alts if they care enough to dress them up nicely. TBC did have some other changes to the profession. The fishing minigame was reduced from 30 seconds to around 20 seconds, and is now guaranteed that a fish would bite. Both welcome changes. But more interestingly was the addition of the infamous Mr. Pinchy, which is a reference to the Simpsons episode where Homer buys a lobster and names it Mr. Pinchy. The weather-beaten fishing journal was added in patch 2.3, which could be fished up from wreckage schools and when used would give you the Find Fish ability, which just lets you detect school fishes on your minimap like find herbs or find minerals. This is also when Old Crafty and Old Ironjaw were added as the factional fishing trophies caught in Orgrimmar and Ironforge by both factions, though it's not easy to sneak into either city as a member of the opposing faction. Then in patch 2.4, the level requirement for the expert fishing book was removed. Formerly, it required level 20. Wrath of the Lich King had big changes for fishing in the first major patch. First, there was no longer a minimum fishing skill required to fish in certain areas. Instead, when you fish in areas that you didn't have the skill level for, you just caught junk items instead. Next, the quest line for artisan fishing was removed, as was the book for expert fishing. The fishing trainers could now just train you all the way up to max fishing. The quest now awarded a special blue fishing pole. While not as good as the Arcanite fishing pole from the Stranglethorn Fishing Extravaganza, it was still a decent pole, giving you a +25 skill, and for anyone who had already completed the quest, they could go back to Nat, and he would give you the pole. Blizzard also added the Sea Turtle mount, which had a small chance to be fished up in schools in Northrend. This was technically the second aquatic mount added to the game, as the riding turtle was added back in Vanilla WoW, but it was only now in Wrath that both of these turtles got a swim speed increase. This is also when fishing daily quests were added to Marcia Chase and Dalaran, which, as with Old Man Barlow and TBC, rewarded a bag of fishing treasures. The loot table was similar from junk items to gems, with standouts being the bone fishing pole and the jeweled fishing pole, both of which gave you a plus 30 fishing skill as well as having a new unique model. The Arcanite fishing pole remained king, but it didn't get a new model until Cataclysm. The final major addition to fishing came in the form of a new fishing tournament called the Kaluak Fishing Derby, added in patch 3.3. On Saturday afternoon, there was a 1-hour window in which you could fish up a black-tip shark and bring it to Elder Clearwater, who was next to Marcia Chase at the fountain in Dalaran. If you were the first person to turn in the black tip, you would get the choice of 2 rewards, an heirloom ring or the Boots of the Bay, which give you a plus 15 fishing skill when equipped and had an unused effect that would teleport you to the Booty Bay Inn. If you were not the first to turn it in, you would instead be given a bag of fishing treasures, the same one you get for the daily quest. The Cataclysm brought comparatively few changes to the profession. On launch, the cursor that hovered over your bobber was changed from the classic golden gear, as it was for all interactables, and instead became a strange-looking fish. This was also when the Arcanite fishing pole finally got its own unique model. As still the best fishing pole, it was nice to see it finally being distinct from the basic ones. Kata also added the fishing daily quest to major cities. At launch, only Stormwind, Orgrimmar, and Thunderbluff, but later on, quests were also added to Ironforge, Darnassus, and Undercity. There were a couple hotfixes early on, one fixing an issue where people who hadn't bought the expansion were able to fish up Cataclysm fish, and another to slow the speed at which you level the profession past 500. Then in 4.06, the cursor was changed again, from the strange fish to the hook icon, which has remained ever since. Later on in patch 4.3, they reduced the fish requirement to level up the profession, counteracting the change they made back at launch. Mists of Pandaria had a number of changes for the profession. First off, you no longer required a pole to fish. If you didn't equip one, you would instead fish with a stick that has a nice little string attached to it. However, they later changed that to just a basic fishing pole. The other thing that happened at launch was due to issues with cross-realm play, Blizzard shut down both the Stranglethorn Fishing Extravaganza and the Kaluak Fishing Derby. The big thing, however, was the addition of the new fishing faction, the Anglers. Based in the Krasarang Wilds, they had a number of fishing dailies and fishing-related rewards for getting their rep up. Most memorable and most used today, for fishers anyway, is the Angler's Fishing Raft, which was a mount-like toy that had water walking and can be fished off of. For those that didn't care for fishing, there was also the actual mount Reigns of the Azura Water Strider, which was a mount that could walk on water. Very handy for leveling or generally getting around before you could get flying, and was one of the best ground mounts in the game before mount equipment was added in the game all the way in BFA. Nat Pagal was also with the Anglers and had his own reputation, and when maxed out he gave you his hat, which gave you a plus 5 to fishing for equipping it and had an unused effect to attach a lure that increased the fishing skill by plus 150, which at the time was the strongest lure that could be applied. In patch 5.1, the Stranglethorn Fishing Extravaganza was brought back, with 3 winners now, and the rewards that previously had been tied to the Kaluak Fishing Derby were rolled into the prize pool for the Extravaganza. So with this, the Derby was officially dead. There were 3 unique green fish that you could fish up each day and turn into Nat for extra rep. In patch 5.2, the chance to catch these fish was increased and the rep game they gave was increased as well. Additionally, a Fish of the Day was added, where in a specific zone each day there would be a large number of skulls that would rapidly respawn, allowing you to fish that zone's fish much more easily. One of the Angler's NPCs that you could see when fishing at the Fish of the Day spot was a female gnome named Salty L, who was named after the L who ran a fishing guide website called L's Extreme Angling. The site stopped updating in Worlds of Draenor from what I can tell, but if you use the Internet Wayback Machine, you can still go back and see an archived version of the site. At the time, it was the premier resource for fishing in WoW. There is a spiritual successor to the site in the form of a guide on Wowhead, called An Angler's Journey, the Extreme Angling Collection Guide, written by a self-proclaimed longtime user of the website, who dedicated the guide to Salty L, saying that their website inspired them to get into fishing. There was also some special battle pets that you can get only from fishing in certain areas. As with everything in Warlords of Draenor, fishing was tied to the garrison. The garrison had a fishing hut building, which would require a lot of fishing to unlock the 3rd level of. But when you get it to level 3, you get to do a lot more fishing to get rep with Nat Pagal. No rep with him carries over from Mob, and at max reputation you could purchase a water walking mount, which was just a recolor of the Azura Water Strider and was data mined as far back as the beginning of Mista Pandaria. You could also buy Nat's Drinking Hat, which has the same on-use effects as Nat's Old Hat, but gives a plus 10 to fishing skill rather than a plus 5 when equipped. Despite having a plus 150 lure effect, this was less important now with the introduction of the Worm Supreme lure. That gave a plus 200 skill. The most interesting part of the fishing hut, however, was that you could fish up a special fish in your garrison, and when you throw it back, it would summon a murloc, and when killed, it had a chance to drop the sea turtle or the riding turtle. The drop rate was low, but it was not considered a rare mob, so you could loot it multiple times a day. This led to full raid groups forming to just try and fish up the murloc. This was the first time a major TCG item was made available in-game. This is also the first time that fishing was required for first aid. But for more on that, check out the video on the history of first aid. Legion was not a letdown when it came to fishing content. Starting out, we have Conjurer Margos, who was located on a floating island just outside of Dalaran. Like Nat in the previous 2 expansions, he has reputation that you can level up, and at max level, he would sell an aquatic mount. As well as a new addition to fishing. At lower levels of reputation, toys that can be used to change the look of your bobber. The toys can be put down and then anyone can click on them to change their bobber. Margos sells 2 of them, the Murloc Head and the Squeaky Duck bobbers. But this was the tip of the iceberg, as Legion added many others by the end of the expansion. There were 12 different bobber toys by the end of it, plus a couple of consumable ones like the oversized bobber, which just made your normal bobber really big. Far more meaningful than all of this, however, was the new artifact fishing pole, the Underlight Angler. This was the pole that finally dethroned the Arcanite fishing pole as the best fishing pole in the game. It is obtained through a questline that first required you to complete the achievement Bigger Fish to Fry, which was obtained by fishing up one of every rare fish in Legion. After completing the achievement, being level 110 and having 800 fishing skill, you'd have a chance to fish up the Luminous Pearl from schools throughout Legion zones. The questline takes you to a scenario where you and Nat Piggle fight Murlocs and fish some fish, then fight a boss Murloc together. This is the last time we've interacted with Nat Piggle to date. The artifact takes a lot of fishing to max out, but it provides some nice benefits. It has the effect of a Hook of the Master Angler, where you would gain a swim speed and become a fish underwater. You gain the ability to walk on water, just passively while it's equipped, and you gain a reduced aggro radius. And despite all of the artifact weapons having their traits disabled, the Underlight Angler did not, as it's a fishing pole, not really a weapon. And all of its effects still work to this day, as of making this video in the Shadowlands. In patch 7.3, the Fisher Friends were added. These were a set of NPCs, 1 per Legion zone each, of which each one has their own reputation and a set of things you can buy from them, including some of the bobber toys I mentioned previously. Another standout for the items that they sell is the Trawler Totem, which increased fishing skill for everyone in its radius. The only other item like this was the Sharpened Tuskar Spear from Revered with the Anglers back in MoB. Battle for Azeroth saw professions changed to now be expansion, so vanilla fishing is 1 to 300, and Legion fishing is 1 to 175 rather than 1 to 900. The only profession that did not get this change was Archaeology, but for more info on that, just check out the video on the history of Archaeology. With this change, a lot of bonuses to fishing skills that I've talked about to this point were rebalanced. To provide a couple of examples, Nat's Drinking Hat used to give a plus 10 skill when equipped, and the lure attached could give you a plus 150 skill. It now only gives a plus 8 fishing skill when equipped, and the lure only gives a plus 10 fishing skill. The Arcanite fishing pole, which gave a plus 40 to fishing skill, now only gives a plus 14. At launch, there was not much in the way of interesting fishing content, just the basic 1 new fish per zone, with a fish that can be caught in all zones and a couple of ocean fishes as well. The most interesting part was the addition of the Great Sea Ray, which was an underwater mount that was just a recolor of the Dark Moon Skate from the Dark Moon Fair, but unlike the Skate, the Ray could be caught out in the world on any coastal waters, though the chance is very low. With the addition of Mechagon and Nazjatar in patch 8.2, a set of goggles were added that could be used to find secret fish all throughout the world, sending you back to the old world. And if you found all the fish, you got the achievement, Secret Fish and Where to Find Them. This is a reference to the Harry Potter book, Secret Beasts and Where to Find Them, as the movie came out just around the same time. But more interestingly, were the references in the toy that you got for completing the achievement, the Hyper Compressed Ocean toy. This toy allowed you to summon an orb that you can click on to fish. And when fishing from the orb, you get fish from anywhere in the world, and you can even fish the Great Sea Ray from it. But this had a niche use in world PvP. You see, in Nazjatar, if you were in war mode, there was a zone-wide PvP battle where both factions tried to claim 5 flags to fill up a bar. But when the battle was over, the winning faction often charged into the enemy base, and if you dropped the hyper-compressed ocean on the enemy portal, the enemy faction cannot click their portal to teleport out, and instead end up clicking on the ocean and begin fishing as they end up being killed. This is the only item I could find from fishing that actually had PvP uses, even if it was only in world PvP. Still an interesting interaction, or a creative use of game mechanics, if you will. Shadowlands added a new bobber based on the Ouroboros theme, as well as a fishing pole with a theme as well. The fishing pole had the same fishing skill bonus as the Underlight Angler, though it doesn't give any of the other bonuses the artifact traits give you. It also increases the chance to catch bait while fishing, but the Shadowlands bait can just be bought at a vendor in Ouroboros, so that's not really a useful effect. There's also a rare in Revendreth, Muck Ribbon, that has a chance to drop the Bat Visage bobber, which makes your bobber look like a Revendreth bat statue. There really hasn't been much for anglers to do in Shadowlands so far, but most updates to the profession didn't come until the 0.1 or 0.2 or even 0.3 patches, so we'll just have to wait and see. Alright, and that's the video. Fishing is a very time-consuming profession, and so it really isn't for everyone. One of my editors once spent 7 hours straight trying to fish up old crafting Orgrimmar, and I know people that refuse to even touch the profession, but I'll leave you with the words of WoW's most prolific fisherman. If you ask me, the best part about fishing is its slow pace. It gives one time to think, to reflect on past events, and plan for future ones. Oh, and it's also a great excuse to drink. Heavily. In this video, we'll be looking at the history of the mining profession, and some of the items associated with it. From Vanilla WoW to Cataclysm, players were required to equip a mining pick in order to tap ores to be able to loot them. This was changed in Mists of Pandaria when most mining ticks had the flavor text of miners need a mining pick for digging, changed to +10 mining does not need to be equipped. Most mining picks in WoW still require the player to have learned the mining profession to be able to equip mining picks. Unlike most other professional tools in earlier WoW, the mining pick did not see different iterations as a tool in the first few expansions. Throughout WoW's entire life, there have been 14 mining picks in the game, more or less. For the first part of this video, we'll briefly discuss each pick, starting with ones added in Vanilla. In total, 10 picks were added to the game in Vanilla WoW, which is where the vast majority of mining picks in the game come from. Today in Modern WoW, you can currently only obtain 6 of these original mining picks. The Gouging pick is the only poor quality mining pick in the game. It is a rare world drop from several starting old world zones such as Ashenvale and Hillsbrad Foothills. Despite several of WoW's item and stat squishes, the mining pick, when used as a weapon, has never done any more than 16 damage and has never sold for more than 7 silver. The next mining pick for Vanilla is the common quality ubiquitously sold regular mining pick. As of writing this video, this mining pick is sold by over 200 NPC vendors in the game. A similar common quality mining pick can also be found in the Elven Forest from Vanilla. This mining pick is called the Cobalt Excavation pick and has a very low drop chance from Cobalt Geomancers. There was only one uncommon mining pick that came from a world drop in Vanilla. This mining pick was called the Tunnel pick and was a rare drop from some mobs in the wetlands. This pick was removed at the launch of the Cataclysm expansion since the wetlands was completely overhauled and these mobs removed. The next mining pick is also of an uncommon quality and is called Brand's Trusty pick. It is obtained by the player by completing the quest Brand's Bronzebeard's Lost Letter in Silithus. This pick can be considered one of the most interesting mining picks lore-wise, since it belonged to the famous explorer Brand Bronzebeard until he gave it to the player. Another uncommon mining pick is called Miner's Revenge, which comes from an Alliance-only quest in Vanilla. This quest is called Oh Brother, which was a breadcrumb quest from Stormwind to the Dead Mines. However, this mining pick was actually not able to be used to mine anything in Vanilla, since it was actually not labeled in the game as a mining pick. In fact, this mining pick only became usable when it was updated at the beginning of the Burning Crusade. The Miner's Revenge pick was removed in Cataclysm when the Dead Mines dungeon was updated. The final 2 mining picks for Vanilla come from 2 dungeons. The first mining pick is the Cold Iron pick, which drops from Hogger in the original Stormwind Stockades. In Vanilla, the pick was an uncommon quality, but in Cataclysm, it was updated to a rare quality item. The Cold Iron pick also did not receive the also works as a mining pick tooltip description until patch 2.3. The second mining pick for Vanilla dungeons is the Digmaster 5000 from Uldaman. This is a very rare drop from trash in the dungeon and is the only mining pick in the game that requires the player to have a classic mining proficiency of 175 to be able to equip it. Only one mining pick was added to the game in the Burning Crusade. The Shatterstone pick is one of the 3 quest rewards that can be chosen after completing the quest Beneath Thrallmar in Hellfire Peninsula. This uncommon quality mining pick was not just a weapon, but it actually worked as a regular mining pick as well, despite it having no description saying it could. This remained unchanged until the Cataclysm when the Shatterstone pick had its tooltip updated to say, also serves as a mining pick. Wrath of the Lich King saw 3 variants of a mining pick added with the creation of the multi-tools with Northrend Engineering. Specifically, the Bladed Pickaxe, the Hammer Pickaxe, and the Gnomish Army Knife, all serving as mining picks as well as having other tool abilities. The next mining pick added to the game came in Mr. Pandaria, the Ancient Pandaren mining pick, which was changed from a one-headed axe to a mining tool in Dragonflight, and it also was reduced to a +3 mining skill down from +10, which was a treasure which spawns in the Jade Mine and the Jade Forest. To this day, it is one of the most sought-after items in the game because it has a special ability that allows the player to loot gems from mining nodes in Pandaria. Warlords of Draenor saw the addition of one mining pick, which was aptly named the Peons mining pick. This mining pick is also a treasure that spawns in the Spires of Erech. Similarly to the Ancient Pandaren mining pick, the Peons mining pick allows faster mining, but only in Draenor. Dragonflight saw the addition of two new mining picks, the Draconium pickaxe and the Khazgarite pickaxe. There was a major profession overhaul in Dragonflight, and most mining picks are now categorized as profession tools. Additionally, several new mining profession equipment items were also added, which included 2 Delver's helmets and 2 ore satchels. While the technical name for mining deposits in the world is resource nodes, WoW has several different names for types of mining nodes in the game. Every mining node with the exception of mineable corpses are labeled as either vein, a deposit, or a seam. The term deposit is by far the most common label for mining nodes. The term vein only has 9 mining nodes associated with it, and the vein name was more common in early WoW, especially in vanilla, in which 5 of the mining nodes are named veins. Seams were only added for Legion and BFA expansions. These seem to have been an alternative to rich deposits or pure deposits of mining nodes. Because Blizzard only added seams for 2 expansions, there are only 7 different types of mineable seams in the game. In a seamless transition, in Classic, only thorium veins had a chance to spawn as rich, meaning they contained more mats than usual. Since Wrath, almost every new mining deposit added to the game has had a chance to spawn as a rich deposit. This is similar to how in Classic, only certain nodes could have a low chance to respawn as a more rare type of mining node. Also in Vanilla, the mining nodes of thorium and obsidian chunks could spawn as small or large. As you can tell, Blizzard has experimented in how to add different types of rarities of mining nodes in the terms of materials produced. Dragonflight introduced 5 different element-infused types of deposits, which included Molten, Hardened, Primal, Rich, and Titan Touch. However, these modifiers are unique to Dragonflight expansion and will probably not reappear in later expansions. Now let's move on to the topic of ores. We'll just scratch the surface on this one, but we'll try to briefly go through each expansion and their main ores used in crafting. In Vanilla and Classic, there are a total of 9 ores. Among these ores, 5 are common ores, which include copper, tin, iron, mithril, thorium, and dark iron ore. Dark iron ore is notable for only being able to be found and smelted in the Black Forge, in the Black Rock Depths, and the Molten Core. There are 4 uncommon ores in Classic, all of which are rare spawn variants of the regular 4 common open world mining nodes. Regular quality tin nodes, when they respawn, can sometimes become uncommon quality silver nodes. Common iron veins have a low chance to become uncommon gold veins, and finally, common mithril veins can become uncommon true silver deposits. The Burning Crusade added 4 new ores to the game. 2 of these ores are common quality, and they are the fel iron ore and adamantite ore. The other 2 are uncommon in quality and are called the Eternium ore and Corium ore. Eternium ore is unique because it is the only ore in the entire game that does not have a specific mining node dedicated to it. Eternium ore only has a chance to be looted when mining the other 3 outland mining nodes, which makes it only one of 2 ores in the entire game that work this way mechanically. Wrath saw some of the lowest number of ores added to the expansion, with only 3 ores being added across Northrend. Both cobalt and serenite ores are common quality ores, and titanium was the uncommon ore added to Wrath. Titanium ore has a chance to respawn the place's serenite node, so it can only be located in the zones of Icecrown, Storm Peak, Sholzar Basin, and Wintergrass. Wrath saw the first handful of updates to the mining profession. First, a new passive ability was given to miners called Toughness, which granted the player a percentage-based stamina buff which scaled with your skill levels in mining. The flavor text of the ability reads, "All your hard work spent mining has made you exceptionally tough, increasing your stamina by X." Both Herbalism and Skinning also received similar buffs. Herbalism granted increase in health recovery and haste, and Skinning passive talent increased critical strike. Also in Wrath, Blizz made it so players could no longer fail when mining, herbing, and skinning. The second major change in mining Wrath was the changing of how many times the players could tap a node to gather all its resources. Mining veins and deposits no longer required multiple hits to receive all the ore, meaning mining ores was now a one and done deal, or at least until the node respawns. These 2 changes of making farming ores faster and ensuring you could not fail at gathering them made the supply of ores in Wrath skyrocket. To combat this a little, in patch 3.2, Blizzard added for the first time a level cap to mining. Specifically, players had to be at level 65 or higher to mine ores in Northrend. The Cataclysm expansion also only added 3 new ores to the game: Elementium, Obsidian, and Pyrite. The first 2 ores are of common quality, and Pyrite is an uncommon quality spawn instead of Elementium. As a fun little antidote, Elementium ore had been in the game since Vanilla, where it dropped from mobs in Blackwing Lair. Most players will know it as part of the crafting reagents for making Thunder Fury Blessed Blade of the Windseeker. When the new Cataclysm Elementium ore was added, the old Elementium ore was renamed to Elementium Ignite. Mining in Cataclysm had one major change, and that change was gaining experience when a character mined a node. Although the mining XP is inversely proportional to a character level, It has not stopped crazy people from doing insane things like never leaving the Pandaren starting zone and getting to max level by just mining nodes and gathering herbs after doing the few introductory quests. Such is the case of the famous double agent character, a Pandaren shaman. There were also 2 minor changes to mining in Cataclysm. First, some of the mining requirements for vanilla nodes were loosened, which made sense with a revamped old world. Second, with Zul'Gurub being removed and completely revamped, the Hikari thorium nodes were also removed from the game. Now, the Mist of Pandaria expansion added 3 new mining nodes, but 4 new ores. The 2 common quality mining ores of Pandaria are Ghost Iron and Kyperite. The last uncommon node is called Trillium Vein. However, when the Trillium node is mined, you can either get a black Trillium ore and or a white Trillium ore. This makes Trillium one of the only ores in the game besides Eternium ore, which can drop 2 different types of ores. Mist of Pandaria also added 2 major changes to the mining profession. One of the biggest in the entire game as far as professions are concerned came about at the beginning of Mist of Pandaria, when Blizzard made it so mining picks no longer required to mine nodes. The second major change came in patch 5.1, when Blizzard made it so all mineral nodes despawned 1 minute after they're tapped, even if the items remain in them. These 2 changes remain somewhat controversial to this day, but the optimistic approach is to say Blizzard was trying to free up bag space with the first change and reduce bot farming with the second change. Warlords of Draenor only added 2 new ores, which is the fewest any expansion has ever added. Both of these ores were common quality ores named Blackrock ore and True Iron ore. As a little aside, it is speculated that True Iron deposits eventually become the Fel Iron deposits found in Outland. These 2 ores are also the only ores in the game that do not need to be made into bars before they can be used. Warlords of Draenor saw 1 major change to the mining profession. During WoD, the maximum WoD skill points available in mining was 700. To help ease the grind for players grinding out the mining skill, Blizzard decided to remove hard skill requirements and add in a yield value to make the progress seem worthwhile. This yield value came in the form of nuggets. Since removing the hard mining skill caps affects all mining from previous expansions, every ore in the game, up to and including WoD, had to have a nugget version that could be mined. For those of you who are not familiar with the nugget system, if the miner is underskilled and attempts to mine a node somewhat within their threshold, instead of ore, they will receive a nugget. 10 of these nuggets can be then combined to form the 1 ore. In short, the yield a miner is able to harvest from each node is now determined by skill level. However, since Warlords of Draenor, this idea seems to have been abandoned. There were 2 smaller changes to the mining profession WoD. The first of these changes was a big overhaul to many inventory mechanics in the game, but the most important of those changes in mining was the fact that ores and other reagents can now stack up to 200. The second change was that many of the profession-specific passive abilities were removed. Not even the miner's toughness ability was strong enough to withstand the purge. On a tangent, the tailoring passive ability Loot More Cloth was actually kept, while all other profession passive abilities were deleted. Now, the Legion expansion added 4 new ores to the game: Laystone ore, Felslate ore, Infernal Brimstone, and Imperium. All of these ores are common quality, with the exception of Infernal Brimstone, which is somewhat debatable as to even if it can be called an ore or not. Infernal Brimstone is of green uncommon quality and is not mined on mining nodes in the ground. Instead, it is associated with world quests where a player must kill a giant infernal destroyer and then mine its corpse to receive the item. Legion also saw several short mining-specific profession quests to help unlock ranks to different mining abilities, with an upgraded rank usually providing a better yield. Battle for Azeroth added another 4 ores to WoW: Monolite ore, Storm Silver ore, and Osmanite ore, all of which are common quality ores, and the 4th ore, called Platinum ore, is uncommon. The mining yield ability ranks also made a return from Legion. BFA saw 1 huge change in the mining profession. At the end of Legion, many profession skill points were getting close to 900. To fix this, Blizzard did something smart and gave each expansion its own separate profession skill bar. This also allowed for a smaller cap for each expansion and is much more preferable to one gigantic profession skill bar for all the expansions put together. While this profession change was applied to all professions, it is still worth noting because of how much it actually changed the mining profession as a whole. Shadowlands has ores that are unusual in 3 aspects. Shadowlands is the first expansion to not feature any quality common ores. Second, each of the 6 zones added in Shadowlands each have their own unique ore that can only be found in that one specific zone. 4 of these uncommon quality ores are from each of the 4 zones Shadowlands launched with. Oxan ore can only be found in Maldraxxus, Fandrum ore in Ardenwald, Sinvir in Revendreth, and Solidium in Bastion. The final 2 ores are both rare in quality, and they are the first rare ores added to the history of the game. These 2 ores are Alethium and Progrenium. Dragonflight brought 3 new mining ores to the game. There is the common quality Cerevite ore, the uncommon Draconium ore, and the rare Khazgarite ore. Another major change to reagents that affected mine in Dragonflight is the ores are now found in 3 different tiers. This idea may seem pretty strange, but it should be noted that this tiered crafting reagent system appears to be a new twist on the upgrading of mining abilities from Legion BFA. Not dissimilar to elementals, if a player has 5 ores a specific tier of an ore, they can combine them to form one of the next ore tier higher. And before we wrap up this video, we'll end on some fun trivia. The first set of trivia is all about mining in alpha versions of WoW. In the original 2004 alpha for World of Warcraft, the spell Find Minerals only lasted for a minute, but it could be upgraded to last for 5 minutes through skill points and levels. If that wasn't bad enough, mining Vanilla Alpha only gave 1 skill point per node, but the player had to tap each node multiple times to gather all the resources in the node. There have been 3 ores that have never made it to the live servers. The first of these ores is the Black Steel ore from Classic. The next 2 are both from Wrath, named Azurite ore and Frost Steel ores. There was also one mining pick from Masters of Pandaria Alpha that never made it to live. It was called the Reinforced Mining Pick and gave a plus 15 to mining. For a final bit of trivia, there is a nice trash item added in Legion called the Mining Sword. With its flavor text that says, "The blade is chipped beyond repair. Swords are not good for mining." And well, that does it for this video. Thanks for watching until the end. The history of mining isn't the most exciting thing, but there are some nuggets of gold in there. With Dragonflight bringing a major overhaul to many professions, we figured now would be a good time to look at the major changes that the Herbalism profession has undergone over the years. First, let's briefly discuss the topic of resource nodes. While not specific to the Herbalism profession, resource nodes deserve to be discussed in their own right before going deeper into Herbalism's past. These resource nodes are sometimes called profession nodes, meaning that they can be looted by gathering or harvesting, which in turn yields raw ingredients usable by the player in many different professions. Any player in WoW which has been out in the open world has seen the ubiquitous resource nodes of mining deposit and herbs. Technically, there are 7 different types of profession nodes, the first of which are mining nodes that yield ores and stones. Mildly interesting fact is that technically only mining nodes have proper names, and the correct names for mining nodes are either veins or deposits. The next profession node is from Herbalism, and these interactable objects are simply called herbs. The final resource node, which can be tracked on the minimap, are fishing schools. The next 2 resource nodes are a little bit more abstract. The first of these is skinning, since any mob that dies, which is skinnable, technically becomes a resource node upon its death. The second of these resource nodes is any body of water, since fish can be caught in any part of the water, and not only in fishing schools. The final 2 resource nodes are a little bit more obscure. The first of these are the gas clouds, which were in several expansions, mainly the Burning Crusade, Wrath, and Cataclysm. These resource nodes can only be looted by engineers with special goggles. When looted, these clouds give the player elemental crafting ingredients. For example, looting windy clouds into Grand and Outland would grant the player motes of air. The final resource node is more of a technicality because it comes from questing. Every time a quest has the player acquire an item by clicking on it, they are technically looting a resource node, since it's an interactable item in the open world which puts items in the player's inventories. Now that we know what exactly a resource node is, we can talk about their history. The first big change to resource nodes came in Cataclysm, which saw the first introduction of gain experience by gathering herbs and mining ores. The next 2 major changes to resource nodes came in Warlords of Draenor. First, the hard skill requirements were removed to harvesting resource nodes, and the yields from gathering nodes became determined solely by the player's profession skill level. This essentially meant you could no longer fail at gathering items, just instead receive no loot from the node. This second and much more important change was the mining Herbalism nodes were no longer able to be looted by multiple people at once. This was presumably done to curtail rapid gold inflation in Warlords of Draenor, as well as discourage bot farmers. The only problem with the system is that if someone has already looted a node in the past minute, it can still visibly appear on a player's client. And then when they go and loot the node, it just disappears and the player is sad and confused. Now we can move on to the main topic of the video. Herbalism is one of the few professions in WoW to have received very little changes in its entire lifetime. One of the more unique things about the Herbalism profession is that it is the only profession in the game which grants temporary buffs or effects to players when they pick certain types of herbs or use herbs items that they have gathered. Prior to Warlords of Draenor, Herbalism granted the Lifeblood ability, which provided a small amount of healing and increased the haste that could last up to 20 seconds and had a 2-minute cooldown. However, this was not a unique ability in the sense skinning and mining had similar abilities but with different stats from haste, such as stamina in the case of mining. All of these profession abilities, including Lifeblood, were removed in the beginning of Warlords of Draenor. Overall, there are a total of 8 of these herbs and herb items in the game which have special uses. The first 5 Herbalism items can be looted alongside herbs. The first item is called a Fell Blossom, which can occasionally be looted from Fellweed across all of Outland. When used, the Fell Blossom grants the player a buff which absorbs a small amount of damage over 15 seconds. This effect is similar to a Priest Powerword Shield ability, and the Fell Blossom also shares a cooldown with the Warlock's Hellstone. The next herb is a rare spawn of Ragvale and Zangarmarsh called Flame Cap. Using this item gives the player a 1-minute buff to their critical strike and fire spell power. Interestingly, Flame Cap is only consumable, and has no use in any crafting ingredients. Multiple Flame Cap buffs can be collected, but they all share a cooldown of 3 minutes. The third herb from the Burning Crusade is called Blood Thistle, and can only be found in Eversong Woods. Only Blood Elves can use Blood Thistle, and it is apparently addictive in the game, with abusers being called Thistleheads. When used, it gives the player a small buff to spell power for 10 minutes. However, upon expiration, the player receives a debuff called Blood Thistle Withdrawal, which decreases the player's intellect by 5 and lasts for 20 minutes. The next herb item is called a Life-Giving Seed and can occasionally be found inside herb nodes and cataclysm zones. This item doesn't apply a buff to the player, but rather is a fun, on-use toy item which stuns the player and turns them into an herb until the effect is cancelled. The 5th and 6th herb items are called Life Spirit and the Water Spirit, and both can occasionally be looted from herbs in Mists of Pandaria zones. Both items have a 5-minute cooldown, with the Life Spirit healing the player a little and the Water Spirit restoring a little bit of mana. The last 2 herbs give a buff directly to the player when they're looted and do not need to be used to activate their effects. Dreaming Glory is an outland herb which when picked up gives a regeneration buff of 42 health every 5 seconds for 15 minutes at max level. The last herb is from Mists of Pandaria and called Golden Lotus. When picked up, it gives the player the Luck of the Lotus buff, which allows the herbalist a chance to find additional treasures on creatures killed for 15 minutes. Now let's move on to bonuses. Skill bonuses boost the player's skill and professions, allowing them to gather more resources and higher quality herbs. Tauren are the only race in the game to gain an herbalism boost with their racial ability. This takes form in the passive talent called Cultivation, whose flavor text reads, Herbalism skill increased by 15, and you gather herbs faster than normal herbalists. Of course, this skill means that Tauren players still need to train in the herbalism skill, but this Tauren racial is very handy, especially when it's combined with the Druid's flight form, since harvesting herbs in the flight form does not remove the Druid's form. This allows for Tauren Druid players to quickly gather herbs and is one of the best ways to farm herbs in the entire game. Cultivation was one of the longest lasting unchanged skills in the game until Dragonflight, where its bonus was reduced from 15 to 5, and they added a key term for gathering faster called Deftness, which Cultivation now increases by 25%. There are currently 3 pieces of gear and 1 tool that can boost a player's skill in Herbalism. The first item is the Herbalist Gloves, which are from Vanilla and give a +5 bonus to Classic Herbalism. However, the pattern is only available to Alliance players and is bought from an NPC in Ashenvale named Harlow Darkweed. It is not that this is an Alliance-only recipe because the bonus the gloves provide can stack on top of the Tauren's Cultivation ability, which would give Horde players an unfair advantage in Herbalism. The Herbalist Gloves are also leather armor, meaning only Druids, Rogues, Demon Hunters, and Monks can use them. The next piece is another set of gloves, this time from Mists of Pandaria, named Forager's Gloves. These gloves allow for faster gathering of all resources in Pandaria, not just herbs. However, these gloves only work in Pandaria and are cloth gear, meaning pretty much anyone can wear them. The next item is also from Mists of Pandaria and is called the Mist Piercing Goggles. These equipable goggles allow players to see additional herbs while in Pandaria. Although they do not need to be equipped to work, they do only work in Pandaria, and they also require mop engineering to make. Luckily, engineers can sell Mist Piercing Goggles on the auction house, so everyone can buy one. The final item that can boost a player's herbalism skill once again comes from Mists of Pandaria. This time, however, it's an equipable tool item rather than a piece of gear, which increases the player's herbalism skill by 10. This item is named the Herbalism Spade, which can be bought from any number of trade vendors throughout Pandaria. Like many other profession items in MoP, the spade does not need to be equipped to give the bonus stat. There are 3 enchants in the game which can also increase the player's herbalism skill level. The first 2 enchants come from Classic, where the Herbalism enchant gives a +2 bonus to Herbalism, and the Advanced Herbalism enchant gives a +5 bonus to Herbalism. The third and final enchant comes from Wrath of the Lich King, and is called the Gatherer enchant. This enchant gives a +5 bonus to several professions, including Herbalism, Mining, and Skinning. Although Dragonflight brings a new reagent bag, which will likely replace many profession-specific bags, we should still look at the history of herb bags. Throughout WoW's life, there have only been 7 herb bags in the entire game, with the last one being added in Cataclysm. Classic had 3 Herbalism bags. The first of these herb bags is a 12-slot herb pouch, which can be bought from vendors in major vanilla cities for 10 silver. The next 2 herb bags are made from tailoring patterns, which are reputation awards that can be bought from the Cenarian Circle. The second bag is called the Cenarian Herb Bag, which has 20 slots and is a pattern sold by Mishta and Silthus for 1 gold and 80 silver once the players reach friendly reputation with the Cenarian Circle faction. To create a Cenarian Herb Bag, the tailor needs 5 bolts of rune cloth, 10 of the hard-to-find purple lotus, and 1 rune thread. The final herb bag from Classic is the Satchel of Sonaris, which is also sold by Mishta. The Satchel of Sonaris has 24 slots, costs 4 gold and 50 silver, and the player must be revered with the Cenarian Circle to learn the pattern. The crafting ingredients for the Satchel of Sonaris are 6 bolts of rune cloth, 2 moon cloth, 1 black lotus, and 4 iron web spider silk. The Burning Crusade saw only 1 new herb bag called Mykon's Botanical Bag, which has 28 slots and was added in patch 2.4.3. The bag's tailoring pattern was a reward from the Sporgar and Zangamarsh after the players revered with the faction, and the pattern itself cost 25 of the infamous glow caps. This tailoring pattern requires 4 primal mooncloth and 2 fel lotus to create Mykon's Botanical Bag. Wrath also saw 1 herb bag added to the game, named the Emerald Bag. This 32-slot bag was added in patch 3.1, and the tailoring pattern to make it could be bought from Kalawak when the player reached revered with the Tuskar faction for a price of 4 gold. The ingredients needed to craft the Emerald Bag are 4 Moonshroud and 6 Frost Lotus. Cataclysm was the last expansion to add herb bags to the game, and it added 2 more of them. The first bag was given the lengthy name, Carriage Going Green Herb Tote Bag. This bag can only be bought by Alliance players, as the only NPC who sold it was located in Stormwind. Her name is Dawn Radu, and the bag has 20 slots which a player could buy for a price of 28 gold. The last herb bag to be added to the game is called the Hyjal Expedition Bag. With a total of 36 slots, it is the largest herb bag in the game. The bag's pattern is taught by the Cataclysm training vendors, and the ingredients require 20 bolts of Ember Silk Cloth and 40 volatile life. And speaking of volatile life, herb gathering is a good source for life elemental ingredients. The theme was carried for 3 expansions, the Burning Crusade, Wrath, and Cataclysm. Inside herb nobes in the Burning Crusade zones, players could find motes of life. And 10 of these motes could be used to create a primal life, which was an uncommon crafting ingredient. The same design and system was used in Wrath of Lich King, where 10 crystallized life created an eternal life, and in Cataclysm, where volatile life could be collected in herb nodes. And before we move on to some statistical analysis, here are some fun bits of Herbalism trivia. Herbalism was originally the only gathering profession that did not require a special tool to collect materials, like how a mining pig is needed to collect ore. The one exception to this rule was the Blood Scythe weapon, which was needed to gather Bloodvine and Zul'Gurub before Cataclysm. There are only 2 herbs to have been removed from the game. The first is the aforementioned Bloodvine herb from Zul'Gurub, which was removed with the Cataclysm update. The second herb is more of a technicality. Its name was Chameleon Lotus, and it never made Otherworld's Draenei beta. Although there can be slight variations on your definition of what an herb is in WoW, from Vanilla to Dragonflight Alpha, there have been 96 herbs in total. The definition of herbs we mean are herbs you can only pick in the open world, and herbs that are whole and completed when picked, so no counting petals, seeds, or other herb items you can obtain when gathering. Classic saw 32 herbs in the game, with all of them being common items except for the 2 uncommon herbs of Bloodvine and Black Lotus. TBC added 10 herbs to the game, with the Fel Lotus being the only uncommon one. Wrath had 9 herbs, with the uncommon herb being the Frost Lotus. Kata introduced 6 new common quality herbs. Mop had 7 herbs, with the uncommon herb being called Golden Lotus. Warlords of Draenei had 6 common quality herbs added, just like Cataclysm did. Legion saw 7 new herbs added, with the uncommon herb being Felwort. BFA had 8 herbs added, with the uncommon herb being Anchorweed. Shadowlands added another 7 herbs, 5 common quality herbs, 1 uncommon quality herb in the case of Nightshade, and 1 rare quality herb in the case of First Flower and Zereth Mortis. So far with Dragonflight, we have 1 uncommon herb with Hochin Bloom and 3 uncommon with Saxifrage, Bubble Poppy, and Wraithbark. Ignoring Classic and how it heavily skews data, we can see each expansion has at most added 10 herbs, and at least 6. The number 7 is the median, being the number of herbs added in Mists of Pandaria, Legion, and Shadowlands. Also, since herbs are usually added each patch, and assuming Dragonflight has 3 major patches, that would be a total of Dragonflight with 7 herbs as well. Assuming Dragonflight has 7 herbs by its end and ignoring Classic, the average number of herbs added by expansions is 6.7 herbs, which would round up to 7 anyway. From an item quality perspective, the vast majority of herbs in the game are common, with the minority being the 9 uncommon and the 1 rare herb. The First Flower is notable as being the only rare quality herb in the entire game at this point. The biggest changes coming to Herbalism and Dragonflight is the introduction of tiered reagents. This idea is not completely new to WoW, as something similar called Herbalism techniques were implemented in Legion and BFA. These techniques saw the player do a quest or have a chance upon gathering herbs to increase the rank of the player's ability to gather a specific herb. Increasing the rank from rank 1 to rank 2 to rank 3 of the gathering ability of a certain herb usually resulted in better yields or an increased chance to find other mats when gathering. Dragonflight seems to be doing something similar, but instead of gathering ability itself being ranked, the reagents themselves are now split into 5 tiers of different reagents. They can roughly be thought of in terms of gear color. That is, a rank 1 reagent is equivalent to a common white item. A rank 2 reagent is an uncommon green item. A rank 3 reagent is a blue rare item. A rank 4 reagent is a purple epic item. And a rank 5 reagent is an orange legendary item. Dragonflight brings back the elemental aspects of crafting in the sense that herbs can now have the Dragonflight special affix: Frigid, Windswept, Decayed, Infurious, Titan Touched, and Lush. The Dragonflight expansion brought a major overhaul to many professions, so we thought now is a good time to look at the history of major changes to many of the professions of WoW. This video will discuss all of the 8 primary professions in the game. But before we go into each profession in some detail, let's go over some of the changes that have affected all of the professions. First, let's go over stack size. The expansion Warlords of Draenei might be controversial, but it did bring a positive change to many players in the form of the reagent bank in the bank. Before WoD, many crafting reagents only stacked to 5, 10, and 20 items, which quickly filled up bag space. Additionally, a player also must have the required ingredients to actually be in your bag in order to craft many items before WoD. Dragonflight brought most of the mats from older expansions up to a maximum stack of 1000. Also added in Dragonflight is the reagent bag, which when combined with the maximum stack size increase from older expansions, should hopefully keep inventories much more neat and clean. One of the other major complaints about WoW's profession system for a very long time was that all the items created when leveling up a profession would be in little demand, and at the beginning crafted items would basically be useless, which made it a waste of time and gold sink to level professions, not to mention using up all the materials never to be regained during the process. Blizzard first tried to allow the recycling and reuse of materials with the Obliterum Forge in Legion. A second iteration appeared in BFA as the Scrapper. This feature was then directly implemented in Dragonflight, where players can recraft many items. In BFA, each expansion was given a separate profession skill bar. This replaced the one gigantic profession skill bar that all expansions had up until that point. At the end of Legion, many skill points for professions were starting to get near the 1000 mark, so chopping each expansion progress into smaller caps made sense thematically, mechanically, and gameplay-wise. Many rare materials in modern WoW are much more easily obtainable than materials from earlier versions of the game's history. One example of these exotic materials included the Red Whelp Scalp from Classic WoW, which only dropped from a single type of mob in the world. Other famous, or infamous, examples are the Blood of Heroes, Righteous Orbs, Larval Acid, and the elusive Pristine Black Diamond. Additionally, many recipes in early history of WoW also required many more crafting materials than the recipes of modern WoW. Some ingredients also required long cooldowns to be created. For example, the Leatherworking Salt Shaker had a 70-hour cooldown in Classic. In Wrath, tailors had to wait 7 days to make another glacial bag. In both Classic and the Burning Crusade, alchemists could only create advanced flask at an alchemy lab, similar to how only blacksmith can make items at an anvil. In Classic, there were only 2 alchemy labs in the entire game. One was in Skullman's dungeon, and the second was in the Blackwing Lair raid. The 2 more alchemy labs were added in the Burning Crusade, one in the Lower Shatrath and one in the Isle of Quel'Danas. Starting in Wrath of the Lich King, the requirement of alchemy labs was removed from nearly all alchemaic items, with the exception of 2 trinkets that were still needed to transmute items in Wrath. The final alchemy lab added to the game was in Arceus the Ebon Hole, which is the original Death Knight starting area in the Eastern Plaguelands. The alchemy lab is nowhere to be seen in the Legion version of Arceus, however. This is not the only alchemy lab to be removed from the game, since with the Skullman's dungeon revamp in Mists of Pandaria, the alchemy lab in the dungeon was also removed. Finally, the alchemy lab is also a building that can be built in the world's Draenei garrison, and is an explicit reference to the original alchemy lab. Unfortunately, it is not actually a true alchemy lab, since certain classic recipes that require an alchemy lab do not work there. A version of the alchemy lab called the Alchemy Table made a return to the game in Legion. This table was located in the shop in Dalaran and served a similar function to an alchemy lab, but was a little different as it wasn't always required. The alchemy table was no longer required once an alchemy had mastered Legion alchemy, and the Broken Isles Master Alchemy could craft items anywhere they wanted after getting enough skill points in their 3rd tier of a recipe. Dragonflight brought alchemy labs back to the game, with there even being a portable one that engineers are able to make. Also in Dragonflight, there is a new type of alchemic item called a phial. Phials essentially replace elixirs, and they can be stacked to increase their duration and also last through death. Up until the launch of Cataclysm, many different types of vials were required to create different alchemaic items. These vials were based on the recipe skill, the expansion, and several other factors. By the time the Cataclysm expansion came around, there were so many different vials from different vendors all around the different worlds, and they were becoming so complex that devs decided to simply merge all the vials into a single one called the Crystal Vial. The Crystal Vial remains in use today as a common base ingredient for many potions and flasks. The official patch notes for 4.0.3 say Deathwing broke all the others because he's mean, or because he didn't want alchemists to carry 5 different vials around with. Now we move over to the blacksmithing profession. Blacksmithing has only really had 3 major changes throughout all of WoW's history. Throughout Classic WoW, a blacksmith hammer was required to craft items. This was no longer the case during and after the Burning Crusade, with a couple of very few exceptions. While blacksmiths do still need an anvil to create items, there have only been 2 anvils in the game where specific items could be crafted. The first of these anvils is from Classic WoW. Dark iron ore had to be smelted at the Black Forge and crafted the Black Anvil, both of which are located in the Blackrock Depths instance. This still remains the case to this very day, but thankfully only a handful of classic recipes call for dark iron. The second anvil similar to this is from Legion. Blacksmiths could only craft demon steel bars on top of Highmountain at a special anvil with the help of the Highmountain Tauren blacksmith masters. In Dragonflight, blacksmiths must travel to the Obsidian Citadel to the Earthwarden's Forge to craft obsidian seared alloy. Now on to specializations. Blacksmithing specializations were removed in Cataclysm. There were 2 specializations which include Armorsmith and Weaponsmith. With these specializations, blacksmiths could focus on certain types of items to craft. For example, while being a weaponsmith, you could further specialize your blacksmithing by becoming an axesmith, hammersmith, or swordsmith. The mechanic profession specializations was not unique to blacksmithing, as many other professions also had them until they were removed in Cataclysm. While not entirely certain, it is believed that devs felt that it was content too few people were doing because specific specializations were often associated with long and intensive special quests, as well as out-of-the-way trainers. From Wrath until Mists of Pandaria, blacksmith could forge sockets onto some specific pieces of gear. In Mists of Pandaria, blacksmith could even sell items that made gear socketable on the auction house. These 3 items were the Eternal Belt Buckle, the Ebon Steel Belt Buckle, and the Living Steel Belt Buckle. Since Worlds of Draenor, Blizzard has removed all ability for players to add sockets to their gear with professions, instead focusing solely on RNG loot, which is still a sore spot for many players. In Dragonflight, blacksmithing underwent quite a few significant changes. First, armor and weapon specializations return, which are much more complex and niche than they were in their original form. Second, smelting abilities are now nestled directly under mining instead of smelting being a separate ability. Third, a new point talent system has been added in which you can use skill points to progress down various blacksmithing talent trees. Now let's move over to the enchanting profession. Like blacksmithing, enchanting has had only a few major changes in the many years of WoW's lifetime. Like most professions early in WoW's history, enchanters originally were required to have various enchanting rods in their inventory to craft and disenchant items. At the beginning of Mists of Pandaria, there were so many enchanting rods, 10 to be exact, that Blizzard decided to do the same thing they had done to the alchemy vials in Cataclysm. At the beginning of Mists of Pandaria, 2 rods were removed, the titanium and eternium rods, and all other rods became useless. The sole victor to emerge from this carnage was the runed copper rod, which became the universal enchanting rod enchanters needed to craft items. As a vestige of the system, players are still required to craft a runed copper rod to enchant anything. Although there are only 2 items required to create the runed copper rod, it is the only profession in the game that their main tool must be crafted. Why Blizzard hasn't removed this extra step and just added an option to buy a runed copper rod from enchanting vendors remains uncertain. There was originally only one high-level enchanting trainer in the entire game in the original WoW. This trainer was located in Uldaman, and the dungeon had to be run in order to meet her. The enchanting trainer's name was Anora. As mentioned, she lives rather inconveniently in the Uldaman instance beyond a crowd of scorpids, and she will only spawn once all the scorpids in her room are dead. Prior to patch 2.3, Anora was the only artisan enchanting trainer in Azeroth, making her important and necessitating trips to Uldaman for all enchanters. In patch 2.3, devs added artisan enchanting trainers to most cities. This resulted in Anora being much less visited after patch 2.3, and her fate with the revamped Uldaman and Dragonflight remains a mystery. Now on to disenchanting changes. The option to disenchant items directly from the loot table was removed in BFA, alongside the rest of the group loot system. While never purposefully intended, it has largely become the norm that dust are common items, essences are uncommon, shards are rare, and crystals are epic. Up until Warlords of Draenor, enchanters could enchant rings. With this stat squish after MoP, many enchants just simply gave too big of numbers on player stats, and devs had to nerf them across the board by removing all ring enchants in Warlords of Draenor. Since then, the Blizzard direction appears to be that enchanters can only enchant armor, while now only jewel crafters can create rings and trinkets with special stats. Many reagents, 16 to be exact, were removed in patch 7.3.5. Additionally, in this patch, materials received through disenchanting now based on the item's expansion level instead of just its item level. Both of these changes came as Blizzard started to begin looking at dividing profession skill points by expansion and pushing out level squishes, both of which went live with the BFA expansion. Next on the list is the engineering profession. Engineering is probably the profession with the second most changes in the game, but we'll try to keep it succinct. Engineers were originally required to have several different tools in their inventory to craft specific items. Since engineers also usually had to carry around various mining and blacksmithing tools, the Gnomish Army Knife was added in Wrath of the Lich King to help alleviate inventory clutter for engineers. The Gnomish Army Knife included a Geomatic Micro Adjuster, an Arc-Light Spanner, Flint and Tinder, a blacksmithing hammer, a mining pick, a skinny knife, and the jeweler's tool set. Unlike most professions, engineers were still required to have their tools in the inventory when crafting engineering objects before Dragonflight. Similarly, despite many professions losing specializations over the years, engineering has kept both the Gnomish and Goblin engineering specializations. In the first several years of the game, engineering was often overlooked and some engineering items were somewhat OP, and could freely be used for PvP. One of these examples were the jumper cables, which could bring dead allies back to life, even in battlegrounds. The first big upgrade to engineering came in patch 2.1, with engineers now being allowed to craft epic guns and a whole bunch of new schematics, which led to a revival of the profession. Patch 2.3 saw even more schematics added, with some of the most notable items being able to create ammo. Indeed, one of the biggest perks of engineering in TBC and Wrath was being able to craft bullets back when ammunition still existed in the game. Additionally, some ammunition was also able to be converted between bullets and arrows with NPC traders, meaning changing from guns to bows was much less difficult. Patch 2.3 also brought the famous craftable flying machine mounts. This precedent of a profession item being able to craft a mount would later be added upon in later expansions. And now in modern WoW, most primary professions can craft at least one mounted pet. Wrath of the Lich King saw the first portable mailbox with Moly, and really saw the profession start to come into its own and take shape into what it is today, with various fun gadgets and gizmos being added. Also in Wrath, up until patch 3.1, you had to regularly renew your Goblin Engineer membership card or Gnome Engineer membership card in order to be able to buy schematics of your engineering specialization. The membership card only lasted 14 days. The final notable engineering event in Wrath was the addition of 2 new craftable mounts, the Mechgineer's Chopper and the Mechanohog. Now, with the removal of ammo from the game in Cataclysm, all various arrow and bullet recipes were removed from the game as well. In patch 4.3, swapping between engineering professions was also made easier. In Mist of Pandaria, engineers could make craftable gear and socket them with a unique kind of engineering gem called a cogwheel, somewhat similar to how blacksmiths could add sockets to some of their crafted items. Next, let's move on to Inscription. Inscription probably has the most changes in any profession in WoW, despite technically being the newest profession since it was added in Wrath of the Lich King. Inscription still retains a tool-required craft item called the Virtuoso Inking Set, and in addition, many recipes also require light parchment, which is only available from trades goods and inscription supplies vendor. In the beginning of Wrath of the Lich King, up until patch 3.1, scribes needed to stand near lexicons of power to apply a glyph, just as a blacksmith would need to be near an anvil to produce items. In Cataclysm, glyphs were separated into the prime, major, and minor categories. They also became permanently learned and did not need to be relearned once a glyph had been removed with the Vanishing Powder or Dust Disappearance. Later on in the Cataclysm expansion, prime glyphs and relics were also removed. While some reorganizing and simplifying the profession is always appreciated, this was seen by many as excessive. Up until patch 5.04, players with the Inscription profession could make an Adventures Journal, which granted an experience buff. Additionally, in Mist of Pandaria, Inscription allowed players to make staves as a new type of offhand weapon, the first type of weapon added to the game in a long time, even if they were just glorified staves. Starting in Legion, Blizzard added Vontus runes to Inscription in the hopes of keeping the profession somewhat alive. These gave hours to days long versatility stat buffs to players, and are sort of a new twist on the scroll scribes can craft. There have been many glyphs added and removed and changed over the years of the game, and we can do an entire video on just this one subject. For every glyph Blizzard added, they had taken away many more. Although Cataclysm saw several glyphs being added, the expansion by far removed more than it added. Glyphs continue to die as Blizzard reworked the talent system of Mist of Pandaria. The straw that almost broke the camel's back came in patch 7.3, when Blizzard just went crazy and started removing glyphs left and right. Blizzard primarily justified their reasoning with the fact that most of the glyphs they removed were related to then outdated gameplay. The glyph system itself also saw major changes, with all major glyphs along with many minor glyphs being converted or completely removed from the game. In the end, the glyphs that were kept were generically cosmetic glyphs. Needless to say, this caused quite a bit of controversy and many are still bitter about it. Starting in BF8, Blizzard added contracts to the Inscription toolset, and these are consumable writs that boost the player's reputation for a particular faction when doing content for that faction. They usually only last a week and provide a very basic plus 5% boost to a specific reputation. Alphabetically on the list of professions after Inscription comes Jewelcrafting. The Jewelcrafting profession was added in the Burning Crusade and has really undergone one massive change since its inception. Jewelcrafters needed a jeweler's kit in their inventory to create most of the items in the profession. Up until Mist of Pandaria, Jewelcrafting also required a simple grinder for many items above skill level 300. Jewelcrafters in the Burning Crusade also needed an alchemy lab to create a handful of trinkets such as the mercurial adamantite. The biggest change to Jewelcrafting came with the launch of WoD. Warlords of Draenor removed the red, yellow, and blue socket scheme which had been in place since the Burning Crusade. All existing sockets prior to Warlords of Draenor were then converted into prismatic sockets. Over the years, Blizzard has introduced several different iterations of sockets. For example, in Mist of Pandaria, there were meta sockets and Shaw touch sockets. Even despite getting rid of gem-colored sockets in Warlords of Draenor, both BFA and Shadowlands had their own twist on sockets, in the form of punch cards like the ones from Mechagon gear, and the Shards of Domination in the Sanctum of Domination raid. Next, we move on to the leatherworking profession. Leatherworking has hardly changed over the years, and it only has one big notable change. Unlike most professions, leatherworking does not require the player to have certain tools in the inventory or equipped to make items. However, during Classic WoW, the only way to obtain some rare leatherworking materials was by using the correct enchantments and weapons with the skinning profession, such as Pip Skinner or the Zulian Slicer. One such example of a very rare material was the Scale of Onyxia, which was needed to craft the Onyxia Scale Cloak, which was helpful to resist Nefarian Shadowflame. And finally, Cataclysm saw the removal of the 3 leatherworking specializations, which were Dragon Scale, Elemental, and Tribal. Last but certainly not least, we have the tailoring profession. Tailoring is a bit like leatherworking in that it does not require, nor has it ever required, a special tool. You would think a needle or something would have been added as a required tool for tailoring, but it never has been. While tailors did not need tools, they did need to be in a specific place in the world to craft certain cloths. For example, in the Burning Crusade, a mana loom was originally required to craft a bolt of imbued netherweave, and crafting spellcloth actually required the player to be a Netherstorm. In addition, crafting spellcloth also summoned an angered netherwraith, so it wasn't for the faint of heart. Up until Wrath, there were 4 others of these special kinds of areas that tailors need to travel to. Spellweave required being in the Azura Dragon Shrine, Primal Mooncloth required a Moonwell, Shadowcloth required the Altar of Shadows, and Ebonweave required the Altar of the Ebon Depths. This mechanic briefly returned again in Mist of Pandaria when in order to craft Imperial Silk, tailors had to stand in the silken fields in the Valley of Four Winds. However, this requirement was removed in Warlords of Draenor. Dragonflight brought back required locations in tailoring and the fact that some cloths are only craftable in certain areas in the Dragon Isles. Now, like all other professions, Cataclysm removed profession specializations for tailoring. Before Cataclysm, there were 3 tailoring specializations: Spellfire, Mooncloth, and Shadowweave. Tailoring specializations returned in Dragonflight. Now, later on, we'll have a part 2 where we discuss all the gathering professions. However, for now, that does it for the history of this video. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to watch part 2 of this little mini-series. Notes: the rest of this video is explaining various issues with this video, so you can turn it off now if you don't want to listen to them all. While writing is technically classified as a profession in WoW's engine, it is covered more by our history of writing and flying video. Also, recipes are not really covered in this video, since we might do a different video on those in the future. Each expansion sees many new quests, trainers, recipes, and many other changes to all the professions, but the vast majority of changes are all relatively minor and aren't really worth being mentioned in a broad overview video like this one. And if you're familiar with this channel, then you might know that there are already videos on this channel that go over various professions. Those videos are different from this one in several ways. First, those videos are presented as a mini Warcraft facts and are not part of a more extensive compilation like this video. Secondly, the older videos on the WoW professions usually go over specific aspects of the professions. It should be noted that many of those older videos came out during Legion expansion 2016, so they're a little dated by now, but the history they go over has not changed. Archaeology was the only new secondary profession ever added to the game, and also was the final profession overall to be added to the game. It had many different parts to it, and today we'll be going over all of those. Archaeology is done by checking your map for shovel icons. Then traveling there, you'd be given an area where you'd search for artifacts, placing down a few tools to triangulate where the artifact is. Then looting fragments and keystones for that artifact. Fragments acted as a currency and could be stockpiled to transform into random rewards, while keystones were items that got placed in your bags and could be sold on the auction house. These keystones could be slotted into an artifact's progress to count for tons of bonus fragments. Upon completing an artifact, a random new one would be selected which could be worked on next. There was 2 types of rewards: the common, which were simply great items which sold for a good amount of gold, and the rare items. These items took many more fragments to craft, but they can also only be found once each. These rare finds ranged quite a bit on what they could be. There was pets, toys, mounts, and gear, and the gear was luckily bind on account, so you could trade with your alts who you needed the most, and some of this stuff was even decent, even competing with early raid gear. Also, with the launch of Archaeology, Dwarves got a new racial to work with it, Explorer, which increased the amount of fragments they found and increased the cast speed of their survey ability. Sadly, Dwarves can't be Druids, or else Druid-Dwarf would have been the optimal Archaeology combo. Now, there was different types of artifacts, of course, found in different zones and different continents, so let's go over them and their rare items. In vanilla, the continents of the Eastern Kingdoms in Kalimdor, there was the Dwarves, which had the Innkeeper's Daughter, the Chalice of the Mountain Kings, the Clockwork Gnome, and the Staff of the Sorcerer Thane Therasane. Fossils, which had the Ancient Amber, Pterodax Hatchling, Fossilized Hatchling, Fossilized Raptor, and the Extinct Turtle Shell. Night Elf, which had the Bones of Transformation, Wisp Amulet, Kaldori Wind Chimes, Highborn Soul Mirror, Druid and Priest Statue Set, Queen Ajara's Dressing Gown, and Tyranda's Favorite Doll. And the Trolls, which had the Haunted War Drum, Voodoo Figurine, and Zincroc Destroyer of Worlds, and was a pretty decent sword at the time. After leveling the vanilla zones for a bit, they could then move on to the Burning Crusade and Outlands with only 2 types of artifacts, with sadly much less rewards. The Orc with the headdress of the first Shaman, and the Draenei with the last relics of Argus and the arrival of the Naru. Then the player could go to Northrend with Wrath of the Lich King and get the Vicrol artifacts. The Vicrol Drinking Horn, Niffler Bearded Axe, the Nerubian, Puzzle Box of Yogg-Saron, and the Blessing of the Old God. The Puzzle Box of Yogg-Saron ended up being probably one of the most memorable items that come out of Archaeology, and has actually been important to the lore many times over the year with its random whispers about Old God plot points. Then, finally catching up to the expansion it was introduced with, Cataclysm, which only had one single type under its belt, which could only be found in Uldum. Sadly, the amount of dig sites per continent was limited, and new ones would not appear until you did the previous ones. So to get Tol'vir fragments, you needed to do Kalimdor dig sites for the other types, and then on completion, hope that the replacement would appear in Uldum. These rewards were the Pendant of the Scarab Storm, the Scimitar of Sirocco, the Ring of the Boy Emperor, the Staff of Amanier, the Scepter of the Ajdakir, the Crawling Claw, and the Canopic Jar. And the Canopic Jar was actually a common item, but it was special, as the item was white quality and could then be opened and contained grays. However, inside was a chance for it to have a recipe for the Vial of the Sands, a crafting recipe for alchemists to make a 2-person flying mount that could be sold in the auction house. and this was probably the most valuable thing to come out of Archaeology. Before we move on to the next expansion, there is one thing Archaeology could do. See, in Cataclysm, dungeons were made a fair bit harder than their past selves, and because of this, Blizzard had a bonus effect at the start of dungeons that parties could activate to make the dungeons easier to clear. However, these could only be activated by an expert archaeologist using a keystone. Although in the later dungeons added in Cataclysm, this was abandoned for some reason, and then never showed up again. Mists of Pandaria introduced a few new changes. First off, any common find you obtained could be sold for gold, or converted into restored artifacts. These boxes could be traded into a vendor for a few things. First, they could be exchanged for boxes of specific archaeology types. Let's say a crate of dwarven artifacts or Tolvir artifacts. You can then open them up for some artifact fragments and possibly a keystone. This allowed you to do Pandaria archaeology while still getting some passive old world artifacts. This is something they would keep doing for every expansion afterwards. However, always making sure boxes were only sold for the past expansion's types, never the current. The next thing you could buy were a few consumables, which included the Lore Walker's Lodestone, which when used teleported you to a random dig site in Pandaria, skipping all the annoying travel time. Another item was the Lore Walker's Map, which when used randomized the current dig sites in Pandaria, meaning if you did not like the locations, you did not have to do them, at a cost at least. And at last, the Manted Artifact Hunter Kit. This item contained two items, a Lore Walker's Map, as mentioned above, and the Manted Artifact Sonic Locator, an item that stayed in your bags for 24 real hours. And while on your person, any new dig sites would only be manted dig sites. So you would get it, use the map, then for the next 24 hours, you could easily find manted dig sites. Although it was a bit odd, as there weren't any other kinds for the other dig sites in Pandaria. Although there was an exploit with this item for a while. If you had it on your person and went to an old world zone like Kalimdor, every time you changed zones, it would reset all the dig sites on the map. So what some players did is use this by going to Uldum, going to the edge of the map, then entering and exiting the zone until an Uldum dig site appeared, and then use this to get as many Uldum dig sites as they wanted, as they were quite rare, and had really good rewards like the Ultramarine Battle Tank and the Canopic Jar, which were quite sought after. The next big thing was that upon completing a common find, it could sometimes give you a pristine version. These pristine versions could then be placed within a small questing hub and would grant the player a restored artifact and some keystones, as well as letting you display the items for only you to see, even have an achievement if you got them all. Although one final thing to note is upon looting a Mogu artifact, you had a chance at a Mogu spirit that once killed would drop a ton of Mogu artifacts. A fun little unique thing that gave a bonus amount of artifact fragments. Then moving on to Warlords of Draenor, we didn't get anything new or unique added. A little fun thing was across the Spires of Arak zone, there was jumping puzzles that had hidden chests that gave Arakoa fragments, and some archaeology skill points, although it made much easier once flying came out. We still have the map and lodestones from Pandaria, but just new Draenor versions, although nothing like the Manted Sonic Locator. You could now buy Pandaren, Mogu, and Manted crates using restored artifacts, as Mists of Pandaria became past expansion content and now qualified for this. Also, the Mogu's chance to spawn a spirit that gave bonus fragments was added to all types in Warlords of Draenor, now meaning every time you found an artifact, you had a chance to get a bonus fragment and key. And well, this is it for Warlords of Draenor. The only other real change being that Warlords of Draenor's dig sites allowed you to find 8 artifacts instead of 6, like all the other continents. Next, on to Legion, the biggest expansion for changes to archaeology. First off, while past zones were limited to 4 dig sites per continent, you are limited to 3 on the Broken Isles. Next, it was changed that when you reach the right area where an artifact is hidden, a shovel will appear above your head, making it much easier to pinpoint the exact location. Then, dig sites were made a lot more compact, meaning much less running around, and also far fewer commons to find. So it was now much easier to collect all the pristines. And lastly, rare items were reworked. While we still have the types of artifacts being demonic, highborn, and Highmountain Tauren, they themselves had no actual rares you could find, only being able to find commons and pristines. Instead, we now had a questing system, a rotating quest found at the quest giver in Dalaran's Archaeology building. This was a quest that changed every 2 weeks and rotated through a large list of items that you had to go do various archaeology things for, from gathering fragments to exploring and killing mobs. And there were a lot of really good items you could get from this, with the standouts being the Spirit of Etero mount, which is a ghostly moose mount. This really changed how rares work, as other than trying to get pristines, there was no real reason to just go out and do archaeology. instead just waiting for the specific quest to appear. But the specific rewards were really good, so I guess it kind of evened out. Then in patch 7.2, they made a couple more additions. First off, they added the chance to get artifact power upon digging, and also added elite dig sites. These sites, which already existed, but had no benefits before, are located in set areas with a whole bunch of elite mobs, marked with a golden shovel. These locations had a higher chance of getting keystones and artifact power from digging. Although in the very next expansion of Battle for Azeroth, we once again return to the old rare system. Seemingly, the weekly quest thing did not work out very well in Legion. But there is one more thing that did get changed with BFA, and that is more something that affected all professions and not just archaeology. See, before BFA, when you trained a new skill, you needed to go expansion by expansion, increasing the skill in that profession. So if you were in Legion, you needed to go back and train in Vanilla, then TBC, then Wrath of the Lich King, then Kata, then Mop, then WoD. Then you could start Legion professions. Although from Mists of Pandaria and after, they did add ways to catch up, but it wasn't great. Like with mining, you could start with Legion, but until you got all the way to Legion mining levels, you would only get nuggets instead of ore. But with BFA, they split up all of the professions to the respective expansions, meaning you could level only the new expansion's levels, or do the past ones in any order. But with Archaeology, they did not change this. You still had the old system. However, the catch-up system was simple. You could do any, at any level, and digging and solving would simply give you skill points, no matter which expansion you were doing. And really, that's it. BFA didn't really add much more for Archaeology, a hint at what was to come, as with Shadowlands, Archaeology got nothing new. No new levels, no new rewards, nothing. While it may in a future patches, as referenced by a broker in game, it very well may not, and may simply be gone until the next expansion, or maybe even never get new content again. Engineering has been quite the unique profession over the near 2 decades that the game has been out, building various gadgets, explosives, mechanical gear, pets, mounts, and enchants. And unlike other professions, almost all of the engineering items were only usable by engineers. Because, of course, anyone can wear a helmet, but only an engineer can operate a hyper-radiant flame reflector. Although many of these machines had a chance to fail, either having no effect, or one that would do the opposite of what you wanted, like random teleports, explosive, fire, stuns, and knockbacks. This made it the go-to profession for PvP for many years, and for some classes even PvE. As one of the original professions, this specific profession came with quite a few unique bonuses. It allows the user to scavenge constructs for various parts used for the profession, as well as bonus loot, but it's mostly just gray items. Its specialty was crafting, machines, gadgets, and of course, grenades. They also made various bits of engineering-specific gear like goggles, guns, and mechanical guardian trinkets, which could be used and swapped out freely. There were many items buildable by engineers, however, like a fair few of the original professions, it got specializations. Upon reaching Engineering 200, you got to choose between Gnomish Engineering, which focused more on average effects with a low chance of failure, and Goblin Engineering, which was a highly unstable but also highly powerful. So here's where I originally listed every single item you could get and make, and what they did, because while something like Tailoring has more recipes, most of them are just random pieces of not special gear. However, nearly everything in engineering is not just stats, and had unique effects. But the video would have ended up being almost 2 hours long, so instead, here is an extremely cut down version, a general idea of things each expansions could craft. First thing was the guns, being the only profession that could craft them, and speaking of guns, they would also craft scopes, the only way to get enchants for guns and bows. Next is trinkets. They had things with a wide variety of effects. Like the reflectors, these series of trinkets allowed you to reflect damage of various types. There was also the mechanical guardian trinkets, these summoning a guardian to protect you, quite good in PvP, use it, swap to another trinket, and still have the pet. And the others I would call utility, rocket launchers, healing kits, mind-controlled nets, etc. Now enough about the trinkets, let's talk about the rest of the gear, the most common being the helmet, which was usually goggles. However, they did have odd stuff too, like shields, helmets, belts, boots, and cloaks, while also being able to make bullets and sometimes arrows for use of range. Next is gadgets. These items have all various uses, like the teleporters to Everlook and Gadgetzan, distracting target dummies, lockpicks to pick locks, consumables of various sorts, fireworks for, well, fun I guess, and tons of explosives, like explosive sheeps, grenades, and even more mechanical guardians, and the amazing field repair bot, which summoned a robot that would allow players to act as a repair vendor, meaning raids could repair mid-raid, without having to hearth out, go to a vendor who can repair it, and then get summoned back. A lifesaver for raid progression nights. And lastly is companions, the one profession in vanilla that could craft companions. They had a fair few, from actual mechanical pets like bombs, robots, and mechanical animals, to others that are just normal creatures called mechanical, like a yeti or a frog. Out of the two engineering profession specializations, Gnomish was better for PvE because of some niche uses, while Goblin was better for PvP with its amount of burst damage and CC. Overall, this made it the best profession to use on your mains, as the amount of combat uses it had was overall more than any of the other professions. The only issue being the professions needed crafted materials from nearly all scopes of Azeroth: jewels, leather, cloth, metal, herbs, and more. So, on to the first expansion, the Burning Crusade. What changed with engineering? Well, a couple of things. First, with the introduction of flying mounts, they added a pair of gyrocopters, crafted and usable only by engineers. They were one for each flying speed, the 60% fly speed and the 280 fly speed one. Made faster by putting cool fire paint and a shark face on it. And the second new major thing is the Zap Throttle Mote Extractor. For crafting various things for the different professions, they got motes of X and Primal X items, and they could earn a ton of different ways, one of them being the ZME. This item allowed you to harvest these floating clouds that can be found throughout Outland, each zone having different types of clouds with different motes insides. This could make it easier by crafting yourself a special pair of goggles, which while equipped lets you see the clouds on your minimap. Although come Wrath of the Lich King, these goggles effects were just moved to baseline to the ZME. And lastly, the toolboxes. In vanilla, they had the heavy toolbox. This had a 20 slot bag, so bigger than most of the boxes and pretty cheap too, but could only hold engineering goods. However, the Burning Crusade, they were able to craft them themselves, a Fel Iron toolbox which holds 24 items. So what else did it get? Well, more so, what did it keep from vanilla? Well, most of the stuff, although this time engineering is made to be even better, funnily enough, making it the go-to for all classes now. Their goggles were much better, their helmets even better, guns and scopes even better, boots better, trinkets, well, different but not really better. Usual explosive ones and the utility ones. Teleporters, yeah, those are back, this time Area 52 Another Storm and Tulshi Station the Blade Age Mountain. And well, they did add a new repair bot, with the only change being it was usable with Outland materials, in exchange for selling class reagents, so a decent upgrade. They also got their usual gadgets, of course. Need to pick locks? Sephorium charges. Frost grenade? Yeah, sure. Super ultra big bomb? Yeah, you got 'em. Even have flame turrets now. Lastly, they did get this little thing called injectors. Now, back in vanilla and the Burning Crusade, and even early Wrath of the Lich King, mana and health pots only stacked up to 5. However, by getting 20 mana or health pots and crafting them together as an engineer, you could make them into health or mana injectors. These did literally nothing different than normal potions, except you could stack them to 20, so it just saved you on bag space. Then into Wrath of the Lich King, we got the new injector kit, one for mana and one for health. By using one of these items, it would convert 20 of your potions into 20 injectors, once again saving inventory space. However, they also gave 20% more healing or mana if it was used by an engineer, giving them at least some of a benefit to engineers, especially since in 3.2, they made healing and mana pots stack to 20, kind of making these injectors pointless for everyone else but engineers. And enough about potions, this time we'll go over the old stuff that got updated. First, we got our usual guns and the usual scopes. Of course, they also got their goggles and even their usual wormhole generator. However, this time letting you choose from multiple locations instead of only having one place you can teleport to. Trinkets as usual, however, far fewer of them. They even got a few special gadgets, like a vehicle healing one, for the all too common vehicle mechanics of Wrath of the Lich King. They got their usual explosives, of course, one of them being the Serenite Bomb, which has a whole history of its own. But for summary, the Serenite Bomb allowed an exploit during the Lich King fight that led to a top guild getting a temporary ban, even though it was used on a normal mode and not heroic. Though, this piece of trivia is one of those in the WoW community that is commonly shared incorrectly, as having happened during the world first kill and not on just a normal farm kill. Anyways, engineers also got the Titanium Toolbox, a new 32 slot engineering bag. So what new things did engineers get? The first big change is that you could now change engineering specializations easier. Before, you would need to do a whole quest chain. Now you just need to pay 150 gold. So what about new crafting recipes? 2 new mounts. Well, 1 new mount, but 2 versions based on the factions. The Mechano Hog for Horde and the Mechaneer's Chopper for Alliance. This recipe required a lot of work to craft, including a lot of money, averaging at about 12k gold to make and buy the raw items. And the best part? It could be used by anyone, letting engineers finally make something they could sell to non-engineers for a fair bit of profit. This mount was the first 2-person mount in the game, being that a second person could get into the bike's sidecar. Next is the Gnomish Army Knife. Up to this point, everyone used to carry around tons of items in their bags for all their professions. But the Gnomish Army Knife sought to cure that, containing most of the needed profession items as well as giving you a plus 10 to all 3 gathering professions. This was simply kept in anyone's bag, although an engineer had a bonus effect to be able to attempt to resurrect a dead ally back to life with it. Next is the Mole-E, allowing the engineer to summon a mailbox anywhere in the open world. And speaking of utility like that, we have one more thing, the Repair Bot. Like Vanilla in the Burning Crusade, Wrath of Lich King had a Repair Bot, however this one was special in only one way. It was a material, one used for Jeeves. This robot was obtained by doing an entire questline and crafting various parts to put together this little robot servant who was no longer consumable, instead having a cooldown. All players could purchase and repair at Jeeves, however engineers could even access their bank from him, and Jeeves is still useful even in the modern day. And the last thing of Wrath of Lich King that will lead us into Cataclysm, Tinkers. Tinkers were special engineering only enchants that you could put on your gear, and some of these could fail doing the opposite of what you wanted. However, the higher level of your engineering would reduce this chance of failure. The hand-mounted pyro rockets, reticulated armor webbing, or hyperspeed accelerators could be tinkered into your gloves. Mind amplification dish, nitro boots, EMP generator, frag belt, and water gliding jets could be tinkered into your belt, with the frag belt having originally been the belt-clipped spironoculars, which allowed you to see glass clouds on your map, till 3.2 when they moved them to the ZME baseline. And the Springy Arcana Wave, a parachute which could be tinkered into your cloak. Lots of these tinkers were incredibly useful and were basically the reason people would take engineering for raids, since the hand rocket was off the global cooldown and was instant cast, so it could just be macroed into all of your abilities. And the nitro boots were just a very useful emergency speed boost that could allow you to outrun most raid mechanics, assuming it didn't kill you and blow up or put a massive dot on you instead. In fact, the tinkers were so useful that they only received nerfs from here on out. So now, on to Cataclysm. First off, tinkers. They removed stats for them, as many of them originally gave a few stats as well. And with this, they made it so you could tinker gear that has enchants on them, as normally tinkers would replace enchants, except for the odd few tinkers that still did give stats. They also added a few more that could all be tinkered into your gloves, a few extra that can be put into your belt, and lastly, the Goblin Glider, a staple tinker for engineers, still used in the modern day, an option to be tinkered into your cape. Returning were the usual grenades, however far less powerful, and even a bolt gun that was actually quite useful. Of course, lockpicking explosives returning, a cool item called the Electrostatic Condenser, which while in your bag gave you volatile air while gathering. They brought back the usual companions in a robot bunny and the personal world destroyer. The engineering bag returned with the Elementium toolbox at 36 slots, with also the first ever fishing box able to contain fishing goods, the Lure Master Tackle Box. They of course made gear, trinkets, able to summon dragonlings, the usual guns and scopes, and the usual goggles, but you may have noticed something off with these gem sockets. Cogwheels. Cogwheels were a new gem type only available to engineers. Bought off vendors using crafted items, you then applied them into your engineering gear, which were stronger than normal gems. Oh, and also ammo got removed so engineers could no longer craft that. And before we move on, there's one more thing to go over, the Looterang. This item is carried in your bags and can even be hotkeyed, and when you use it, you'll target a creature nearby and loot it within 40 yards, which is very helpful if a mob dies on top of a cliff or something. So as you can see, the amount of new stuff being added is not that big. With Pandaria, they only had a few small changes. First off, the Tinker's Kit got added, purchasable from vendors or crafted by engineers, and could be used in place of the usual crafted materials to tinker your gear. Another change was Pandaria added recipes for low-level engineers using Pandaria materials. This one being one of them, that allowed you to max up your engineering only using Pandaria content. Amidst Pandaria, engineers got their usual wormhole generator. They also got another dragon summoning trinket, this time with some cogwheel slots in it. They got a pair of mist-piercing goggles, while in your bag they allowed you to access mining/herbing nodes that are normally covered in mist. These could be sold and held by anyone, not just engineers. They also got a couple of pets, a dragonling, a rascobot, and a cooking stove robot you could even cook on. A new item called the Thermal Anvil, a 20 charge consumable that lets you summon an anvil and forge anywhere you want it. They also got their usual explosives, including the locksmith ones, though still not that good. And in place of the new engineering toolbox, or fishing box, they got a cooking bag that could carry up to 36 cooking items. And as always with engineering, they got their goggles, guns, and scopes. Before we move on from Pandaria, there's a couple of more things to cover. First being mounts. The Sky Golem, crafted by 15 days worth of crafted materials. The mechanical shredder allowed its pilot to harvest herbs without dismounting. making it the go-to herby mount for non-druids. Then there is the depleted Kyperium rocket and the geosynchronous world spinner, both crafted the same way, using a ton of gold and materials. However, the rocket being for goblin engineering and the world spinner for gnomish engineering. And now, the biggest part of engineering from Pandaria, the Blingatron. This robot is able to be summoned by engineers and anyone can accept its quest, which is just a free gift box. Now on screen you will see the full list of stuff he could give you. A couple of mounts, some pets, gems, and a lot of great items with actually good values to them. This quest could only be obtained once per day per account, so you couldn't spam create tons of alts to try and get lucky. Now on to Warlords of Draenor, with the first thing being they removed most of the profession bonuses, and so with this they removed most of the tinkers from the game, leaving behind only a few. The second thing being the garrisons. Inside you could place buildings to do one of the professions, giving every player access to at least the base level stuff of some of the other professions. The engineering hut sold some engineering items like the Gum E, a mailbox, 3 engineering trinkets, references to the original vanilla versions of themselves, and Walter, allowing you to access your bank, and a vendor for everyone else. And all of these worked for non-engineers. Non-engineers could also create some engineering goods, so they wouldn't need to hire an engineer of their own or swap professions. Warlords of Draenor really did ruin the idea of personal professions. Blizzard really liked the Blingatron, and so did the players, and so they brought it back. This time the Blingatron 5000. This Blingatron having something wrong with it, as it will now attack and kill any other Blingatrons nearby. And with this new model, the clarity had to be made that you could only get 1 Blingatron quest per day, not one from each Blingatron model. And this new model gave all the same stuff as the one before it, however, of course, giving Warlords of Draenor specific resources and potions instead of Mist of Pandaria. Goggles were here to stay, cause of course, however, losing their cogs, as they would become no longer usable sadly. Instead, goggles being given unique effects again, and they can also craft a gun enchant with its own scope, which randomly generated secondary stats which could be upgraded to a higher item level and re-rolled, both crafted by engineers. There was Findel's Looterang, which was a version of the Looterang that could be crafted by engineers, but then sold and used by anyone. However, as it kind of ruined the specialty of engineers, come the next expansion, this item was limited to only be usable in Draenor. They also updated the Gnomish Army Knife as the ultimate Gnomish Army Knife, adding in every profession tool now, with a version for non-engineers and a version for engineers that still had the attempt at revival on it. And of course, they would also get their usual wormhole centrifuge again. And of course, various consumable items, like the Goblin Glider, now available to all players, and grenades, shields, and stealths. Lastly, pets. They added 3 new ones, a mechanical toucan, a mechanical scorpion, and mechanical boar, with only the mechanical toucan actually looking mechanical. Seems Blizzard really likes to make these lifelike mechanical creatures. Although at least with the introduction of pet battles, it made sense to give some beast animals the mechanical typing. Most of these things using the engineering-specific daily crafted material of the expansion, which all crafting professions had in Draenor. When Legion introduced the Transmog and Toy tab, many engineer items got added as toys, including tons of old useless items that just had cosmetic effects. However, some would not, for example, Warlords of Draenor Swap Blaster or Wrath of the Lich King's Jeeves. But Mole E and many of the Blingatrons were. It also introduced profession ranks. Through gathering, crafting, and questing, you were able to unlock higher ranked versions of your crafted recipes, and gathering skills, allowing you to gather/create more, or create them cheaper. Engineers would get their usual goggles, able to fire bullets, and be upgraded to higher item levels, and reroll stat-wise of course. And now, here's where I would say gun as usual, but the artifact weapons were a thing in Legion, so instead, engineers could craft 2 relics. Legion introduced taming mechanicals to hunters, as they introduced the gnome hunter to the game. However, for those who were not gnomes or goblins, they would require a mecha-bound imprint matrix crafted by engineers, which even lets you track mechanicals as a hunter. They also brought back fun gadgets, and not just the usual grenades. I mean like lots of really fun stuff, including the auto hammer, a consumable that summons a vendor that you can repair at but you can't sell, and anyone can buy and summon these, and the failure detection pylon, which would res your nearby party members after a wipe. But we can't list them all here because it would take all day, so let's move on. Now, the more cosmetic side of things. They got the non-combat pet trigger and the Blingatron puzzle game, which requires you to uncross wires, even having an achievement for getting very far in it. This thing having been reused from one of the Nazjatar world quests. They also got their own usual wormholes, multiple forms of them, one for specifically Argist and one more that requires a bit more explanation. Reeves. This robotic companion was earned by doing a small little quest line, and once unlocked could be summoned using Reeves' battery, consumed on use but with a short cooldown. You could get a permanent version, but it had a much longer cooldown. And while this robot did not do much itself, you could go around Azeroth, New Zones, and Old to unlock them and craft unique modules for it, which once added to Reeves would appear every time you summoned him as an option to transform into. The Wormhole Generator, to allow you to wormhole generate across the Broken Isles. The Snack Distribution Mode, which gave a basic feast. The Repair Mode summoned an Auto Hammer. Piloted Combat Mode made it into a vehicle which the player could use to fight enemies, although by the time you can get it, it was far weaker compared to just a player. The Fireworks Display Mode, which allowed you to deploy fireworks from him. The Failure Detection Mode, which turns it into a Failure Detection Pylon. And lastly, the Bling Mode, turns it into a Blingatron 6000. And again, same as the 4000, 5000, but Legion stuff instead of Mop or Wad. But you could also get legendaries from this cache, meaning it was almost necessary to try and open a Blingatron every day to maximize your drop chances at one. Now, for Battle for Azeroth. First off, professions were split up by expansion now, so you didn't need to level up 600 to get caught up. You could start each expansion from scratch. And with the 0.2 patch of the expansion introducing Mechagon and Engineer's Paradise, you would hope there'd be a lot of new stuff for engineering. First off, the usual stuff. Guns with Alliance and Horde versions, and a hammer. First time in a long time engineers have been able to make weapons other than guns. And of course, they needed scopes. However, they also got ammo, which, while called Frost and Fire ammo, it was really just scopes, but they made your attacks deal extra elemental damage. They also got their usual wormhole generators, one for Koltaros and Zandalar. They also got a pet in the Mechalantula, and a couple of mounts too. First being the Zilliwag ATV, a hover ship that is created by combining two parts. One, the chassis made by Blacksmith, and the other, the engine made by engineers. Second, I'm going to do a quick summary of... See, I didn't mention goggles earlier, as they are super important here. In BFA, we got Azerite gear, and the engineer's goggles fit into that slot. So, they got a custom Azerite gear that also gave them 20 extra engineering skill. The second row had a special engineering-only powers. Getting one of these powers also increased your engineering gain from 20 to 55. Raised again to 85 once you got to the fourth row and chose one of the two engineering unique Azerite powers, the Auto Self-Cauterizer or the ever-adorable Personal Absorbotron. And all of this led to getting their other mount, the Mecha Mogul, which could only be obtained by an engineer with above the normal cap engineering, gained through these goggles. You needed above 150 engineering at least to get the three main items, with higher engineering skill giving you a better chance. You would farm mobs by killing robots within a dungeon and salvaging them, mythic only of course, or killing the final boss. You would also need to buy an item for 30k gold and also get the remote, which required a total of 250 engineering, which could only be achieved by getting engineering 225 for maxed out goggles, and then drinking a potion that would drop from the dungeon trash, and killing the final boss, who also dropped the recipe itself by the way. This epic mount required a lot of work, but it was worth it. You could sell it and it just looked good. A goblin version of Mimiron's head with machine gun, and full high quality graphics in comparison to Wrath of Lich King's now outdated polygons. One more unique thing about BFA's engineering was the legendary Tools of the Trade, added in 8.1. For Engineer, this was the Uber Spanner, earned through a really amazing engineering quest. This giant wrench, unlike other tools, did nothing for the profession itself. All it did was allow engineers to summon an Uber construct to help them in combat for a bit, on a 15-minute cooldown. And this only worked in the open world, which made it probably the least useful. However, it was super fun to use. Originally coming with only a few constructs, it did get more and more modules, although these were simple consumables that guaranteed the next use of your Uber Spanner would be that specific construct, as normally it was random. So let's go over them quick. Pogo summoned a jumping robot that would jump in a straight line, dealing damage to enemies in its path. Scrap Cannon summoned a turret that would blast enemies with a decent amount of damage. The Uber Coil was a Tesla coil that would appear and chain lightning nearby enemies. The short fuse boombots were a swarm of boombots that would charge your target and create a swarm of explosions. The Uber Sentry MKX-8 summoned a mechanical hound which would attack your enemies in bites and fire breath. And lastly, the Uber Improved Target Dummy was a boombox that flung itself at your enemies to taunt them. Overall, these constructs were really good for open world content, as they gave you a good bit of burst damage or tanking, and were actually really good for world PvP, as they seemingly did not get downscaled. So it was common to see an engineer who summoned a scrap cannon melt a target. Well, except for the dummy, that was useless in world PvP, except maybe to distract mobs. Sadly, once Shadowlands came out, this thing was made useless, as leveling up made it unusable. With these two things combined, this really made engineers feel more unique than it ever has. Almost like their very own tinkering class, just from a pair of goggles and a spanner. They also got a couple of gadgets that I'll go over real quick. 8 battle res, usable by any class, which is extremely useful to the point where the only reason I take Engineer to my Priest is to have a battle res in Mythic Plus dungeons. The portable transmog, portable stable, a mount speed booster, a pair of follower equipments, a rocket boat to fire grenades, poison grenades, and sheep grenades. They also finally got some new tinkers for their gear. The holographic horror projector, the miniaturized plasma shield, and the personal space amplifier, all 3 for the belt. And of course we end off on the Blingatron 7000, the final Blingatron at the time of this video. Same thing as usual, having a chance of giving engineer mounts, pets, some vendor grays, and current expansion's resource and potions. So we shall see if the new Blingatron comes out in 9.2 whenever that comes out. Although there is something of note, the decoded messages. I highly recommend looking up their lore, as there is an entire subplot going on with the Blingatrons about some craft world being in danger, a great war spanning the infinites of machine creation, and Blingatrons giving us gifts simply to keep us distracted. Now on to Shadowlands with the final expansion. As the time of this video, 9.1 is out and 9.1.5 is on the way. So of course the expansion is not over. But even with that in consideration, engineering is disappointing. First off, goggles and guns. They got 1 of each and they are just hilariously weak. They are very low item level, and while you can customize their stats, using Shadowlands' new crafting systems and even upgrade their item level, by the time you can upgrade them, you already outgear them. However, 9.1, they did add new upgrades that did make them quite a bit better, but even then, these pieces are easily replaced with heroic raid gear. So I guess this is useful for those doing LFR/normal. So what did they actually get of merit in Shadowlands? Well, let's go over more of the bad first. No mount and only 1 pet, being an unusual pet recolor. They also got their usual scopes, of course, and they got 3 new grenades, a bola bomb, a grenade, and a shadow landmine. So, now into the good, the wormhole generator. While normally, for Shadowlands where all the zones are disconnected, meaning very long flight paths or portals, being able to, on a 15-minute cooldown, teleport to any of these Shadowland zones, even including the Maw, and right into Korthia, was just all too amazing. With how useless most professions are in Shadowlands, this thing alone is worth swapping to Engineering 4, because of how convenient it makes moving between the zones. They also got 3 new tinkers, these not using the tinkering kits, instead using a lot of expensive materials. The 3 choices all being for your belt: the Electro Jump, the Dimensional Shifter, and the Damage Retaliator. They also brought back the Combat Res item, this time with the disposable Spectrophasic Reanimator, as they made the BFA one unable to work on higher level targets, and still very useful in Mythic Plus dungeons if you don't have a Battle Res class. They also got 3 cool reusable gadgets that can, wickedly enough, be used in Battlegrounds. The Soul Trap, which places a small trap that when an enemy steps into, gets them banished. Quite a great way to banish targets, or even pesky rogues who might try to stop you from capturing bases. The Gravimetric Scrambler Cannon, which fires a shot at a specific location, slowing enemies and launching them in random directions. Need I say more than Eye of the Storm? And lastly, the Momentum Redistributor Boots, which when used causes your incoming falling damage to be redirected to whatever you land on. Quite good if you jump off a cliff and see enemies below you, or if you know war mode is enabled and enemies might be below. Now, for this next part, normally I would include these all throughout the video as they became relevant, but I will mention them here because it's just easier, and also the video's already way too long. Engineers have had a lot of extra bonuses over the years. For example, engineers inside the other side are able to activate a button in the slime room before the mana storms to turn off the slime gutters. Meanwhile, engineers in the Court of Stars, which will be returning to with the Legion Time Walking, were able to activate a switch to disable all the construct enemies in the dungeon, making it quite a bit easier. Although which profession's buff spawn in the dungeon is random. And lastly, gnomes. Gnomes have always had the racial to increase their engineering, and they have their own video of a history on engineering if you want, which may or may not be out yet by the time this video is live. Overall, engineering is only really kept relevant by its utility in the stuff added almost a decade ago, but is still somewhat useful today. The Looterang, Jeeves, Reeves, the Blingatron, the Wormhole Generator, and the B-Res items, the Tinkers, all of it's still very useful to this day, but most of it is very old. And it's rare that something new will be useful for a long period of time. But here's hoping they get some amazing engineering content in 9.2, or just remove the profession and add a tinkering class instead. In the early days of WoW, First Aid was a crucial profession for both questing and PvP, but as player power increased and leveling became easier, it slowly fell out of use. In this video, we'll be talking about the rise and fall of the First Aid profession. At launch, the first aid trainers in the main cities could only train you up to Journeyman First Aid, which is the 150 skill level. You would then have to either go to Stromgarde for Alliance or Dustwall Marsh for Horde, to buy a manual that you could use to learn Expert First Aid, as well as a manual for Heavy Silk and Mageweave bandages. To learn Artisan First Aid, you had to do a quest called Triage, which is in Hammerfall Arathi Highlands for Horde and the Theramore Dustwall Marsh for Alliance. The first aid trainers in Ironforge and Orgrimmar had breadcrumb quests to get you there. Interestingly, despite the Triage quest teaching you Artisan First Aid, it wasn't until patch 1.2 that the guy you learn Artisan First Aid from would actually teach you Heavy Mageweave bandages, Runecloth, and Heavy Runecloth bandages. So you could get Artisan First Aid at launch, but you wouldn't be able to actually get to 300 First Aid skill until patch 1.2. When Blackwing Lair came out in patch 1.6, a new anti-venom was added, the Powerful Anti-Venom, which could cure poisons up to level 60. While this wasn't effective in PvE, as bosses were level 63, in PvP this was great. Unless you were a rogue, then it sucked, as people could take your poisons off of themselves. Later on in patch 1.8, the level requirement to do the Triage quest and learn Artisan First Aid was decreased from level 40 down to level 35. In one of the earliest patches in Wrath of the Lich King, in 3.1, you no longer needed to do the Triage quest to learn Artisan First Aid, and all the bandage training was moved to trainers in major cities, including both the ones that he taught, as well as one that you had to buy from books in Stromgarde and Dustwall Marsh. And fun fact, the Triage quest is still in the game, even today, though only for tailors. For the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King, there were no new anti-venoms and only 2 bandages of the new cloths, the base and the heavy versions. In the next 2 expansions, Cataclysm and Miss, they increased this to 3 bandages. Cataclysm added the dense Ember Silk bandages, and Miss technically had 2, but you could upgrade the heavy and Windwool bandages to cost 2 Windwool cloth instead of 3, so it was more efficient. For the most part though, the profession was kind of stagnant at this point, with the one big change being that the trainers in cities could now train all ranks from apprentice onwards, and the vendors who sold the manuals for Horde was moved to Moonglade to be a druid trainer, while the Alliance vendor just had the manuals removed. The first interesting change to the profession happened in Warlords of Draenor, where you learn the first anti-venom the profession had gotten since Vanilla WoW, as well as an oil called the Fire Ammonite Oil, to remove diseases and decrease the duration of any new diseases applied by 50% for 2 minutes. Also, the first and only healing potion that you can make with First Aid, the Healing Tonic. Interestingly, however, none of these required cloth, as the profession always had. Instead, they required materials gained through the fishing profession, which had throughout the game's history been more closely tied to cooking than First Aid. Legion was the last expansion that had First Aid as a profession, but it certainly went out with a bang. It had 3 base bandages, the Silkweave Bandage, the Silvery Salve, and the Silkweave Splint. As in Warlords of Draenor, the salve was made from fish, and the splint actually required laystone ore, the first and only mining material used in First Aid ever. But on top of these, Legion also added a bunch of NPCs across the Broken Isles, and while killing enemies in the open world, you could get a note that would direct you to one of these NPCs, and you would then have to heal them with a specific First Aid ability you gained, like Treat Burns or Set Bones. And if you got the notes and saved all the NPCs, you got an achievement which awarded the title Field Medic, a great title choice for healers everywhere. Then in the Battle for Azeroth pre-patch, the profession was removed as a secondary profession, with all the items it created being moved over to tailoring and alchemy. First Aid was originally a way for all classes to have some kind of healing ability. Then, when the game evolved to a point where everyone already had some kind of healing ability, and they refused to remove the restrictions on actually using First Aid, it kind of just became redundant, and that's why they decided to just remove it. But they didn't want to have to actually remove everything in the game associated to First Aid, so they just moved those over to 2 existing professions. In this video, we'll be talking about the history of the secondary profession, cooking, in World of Warcraft, from its release in Vanilla WoW all the way to the present day in Shadowlands. Cooking was added right at the start of Alpha WoW all the way back in 2003, before even half of the original races were playable, and has gone through a number of changes, though remained relatively similar throughout. In Vanilla, as with all secondary professions, leveling it was not as simple as just going to a trainer, and there was no spiced bread to cook to get your skill to a quick 60. You had to get 9 boar meat or stringy wolf meat to get to 10 skill in cooking. Then you could cook spiced wolf meat, which would carry you all the way up to 50 cooking skill, and it would have to because the next recipe you learned from the trainer was boiled clams and coyote steak at skill 50, though this could be supplemented with specific cooking quests from both factions. Alliance, however, were heavily favored in this, as they had 14 faction-specific quests that gave them recipes while the Horde had 4. In fact, these quests, along with the cooking recipe vendor in Stormwind that sold the recipes from all these quests, has been often cited as an argument that Blizzard favors the Alliance over the Horde. Now, if you didn't want to level cooking the traditional way, you could also level it entirely through fishing all the way from 1 to 300. But that's pretty boring, so for the most part we'll stick to what the Cooks of Azeroth would train you in. After getting the previous 2 recipes at 50 skill, the next recipe you learned was crab cakes at skill 75, dry pork ribs at 85, goblin deviled clams at 125, and spider sausage at skill 200. That for both factions is all that you could train from the trainers. Just 7 recipes, as most of your cooking recipes came as either world drops or from quests. Again, unless you were Alliance. As with fishing and vanilla, to learn expert cooking, it required you to go out into the world and find a vendor that sold the rather cleverly named book, Expert Cooking. This was another place that the Horde got a bit shafted with cooking. As for the Alliance, the book was sold in the Silverwind Refuge in Ashenvale, but for Horde, it was sold in Shadowprey Village in Desolace. And you see, the mobs in Ashenvale range from levels 18 to 30, while the Desolace mobs are level 30 to 40. So the Horde had to wait a whole extra zone essentially to learn expert cooking, but that was probably okay as they had fewer options on what to cook. Especially if you were an orc or troll, as leveling in Durotar, there were no wolves, just lots and lots of boars. So you're pretty much just cooking boar meat all the way until skill 50 anyway. This does all even out when we get to the quest for artisan cooking, however, as the quest Clamlet Surprise is a neutral quest that comes from Gadgetzan in Tarnaris, which is a level 40 to 50 zone, and requiring 10 giant eggs, 10 zesty clam meat, and 20 fine aged cheddar. And while you can buy the giant eggs off the auction house, they only drop from birds or owl beast of above level 40. In patch 1.8, the minimum level requirement to get the quest was lowered to 35, but you'd still have a rough time actually getting the giant eggs if you wanted to farm them yourself. And even with the level decrease, you still had to have 225 cooking to get the quest. It was worth noting, however, that all the recipes that only the Alliance could get could be sold on the neutral auction house, so that the Horde could use them too, as they weren't buying on pickup. And fun fact, this was the only way for the Horde to have any use at all for any kind of spider meat. So if you are leveling as a Horde character on Classic and are saving spider meat in your bags to later cook, don't. Unless you plan to visit the neutral auction house and try to buy a recipe. Cooking was very useful when leveling, unless you were a mage, as in vanilla you would often be at low health after fighting more than 2 mobs at a time. And it was also a good way to make money, as cooked meats are worth usually twice as much uncooked when selling them straight to a vendor. A particularly useful recipe is jungle stew, which you can get in Stranglethorn Vale, and for just 1 tiger meat, 1 refreshing spring water, and 2 shiny red apples, you turn roughly 1 silver worth of ingredients into 6. And this is a really good way to make money solo when you're nearing 40 and trying to get your first mount. In addition to the more traditional foods that healed you and gave you the well-fed buff, which in vanilla only lasted for 10 minutes. There were also a couple of special foods like the Deviant Delight, which you could turn into either a pirate or a ninja for an hour, though druids and shamans shifting from forms lose the effect, and before patch 2.3 in TBC, if a shadow priest switched shadow formed, they too would lose the effect. There was also a special recipe that only rogues could learn called Thistle Tea, which required 60 cooking and functioned like a potion, as, when used, it restored 100 energy. And it also required Swift Thistle to create, so really the only reason it wasn't crafted through alchemy was likely so that all rogues could pick it up, and not just alchemists. Last but not least, vanilla had the one and only epic rarity food in the form of Dirge's Kickin's Chimera Chops, which were added in patch 1.9 and were a reward from one of the quests in the long chain to open the gates of AQ40. Moving on to the Burning Crusade, cooking was increased to 375, and again you had to buy a book to learn the skill increase, with the Master Cookbook. But you didn't have a long journey to find it, as it was sold from Chef Gatson and Baxter in each of the factions' main hub in Hellfire Peninsula. And unlike the recipes in vanilla, in TBC all recipes had parity, as while they were still all learned from quests, each faction had the same quests just from different people. And no, the Alliance did not have an extra vendor for these recipes. Both factions got spiced bread as an easy recipe to get to 60 skill, as the materials required were bought from a vendor rather than farmed like in vanilla. So the initial cooking grind was easier. However, you still had to go to Ashenvale or Desolace for expert cooking and do the quests and gadgets on for artisan, so it was still a bit of a grind. The most impactful change to cooking at the time was the change in the duration of the well-fed buff you'd get for eating the various stat foods, as its duration was tripled from 10 minutes to 30. There was also some endgame to cooking now, as some dailies were added to Shattrath in patch 2.3. They required level 70 to do, but only 275 cooking, which was pretty low considering most of them required Outland cooking recipes to actually accomplish. The reward for the quest was your choice between a barrel of fish or a crate of meat, each of which had a chance to contain uncommon or even rare cooking recipes, like Kibler's Bits, which would make your pet bigger, or Storm Chops, which gave you a chance to deal some lightning damage to your target. Even the delicious chocolate cake recipe, which could drop in the future, which would be part of no less than 3 achievements, though those weren't added until later. With Wrath of the Lich King, the cooking skill increased from 375 up to 450, and with this, all the levels of cooking became trainable at the cooking trainer, so you no longer needed to go hunt down books in the world or do the quests and gadgets in. Gone were the days of learning your trade out in the open world. Centralization had come, and now everything you needed was in the main cities. The other main change to cooking during Wrath was the addition of the fish feasts into the game. Today, we all know them and use them quite often when raiding, but this was their introduction. The first one, called the Great Feast, was learned at 375 cooking from a trainer for 4 gold and 75 silver. As Wrath added all of the cooking levels to trainers, it also added many new recipes to them as well. As Wrath cooking, or as it was called Grand Master cooking, was learnable at skill 350, it added upwards of 20 new recipes between skill 350 and 375, in addition to the numerous recipes from 375 up to 450. This is a trend that would repeat itself throughout the next few expansions. However, where TBC had most of the base recipes behind quests, and the special recipes as random chances from the daily boxes, Wrath changed it up a bit. And in the $1 cooking dailies, you got a chance at the rare recipes from TBC, as well as currency. And for 3 of the currencies, you could just buy the recipes from a vendor, which was a nice welcome change. In patch 3.2, they also added the recipe for the Captain Rumsey's Lager, which was originally only obtained through the bag of fishing treasures in Outlands and TBC, to both the cooking daily bags from Northrend as well as the crates of meats and barrels of fish from the Outland cooking dailies. And while the Outland cooking dailies required level 70 and only 275 cooking, the Northrend cooking dailies only required level 65, but 350 cooking. A bit of a strange choice, but hey, why not? Circling back to the topic of feasts, there are 3 others added. The fish feasts, like the Great Feast, gave a bunch of stats, and again, Blizzard had buffed the well-fed buff, so it now lasted for a full hour. But the other 2 feasts are more interesting ones, these being the Small Feast and the Gigantic Feast. In the same vein as the Deviate Delight from Vanilla, either made you bigger or made you smaller, though unlike the Deviate Delight, this one can be shared with all your friends. The last substantial change to cooking was now many of the foods actually restored mana as well as health. Previously, food would restore your health and drinks would restore mana, with only a few that did both. But now the majority of recipes you could do did both. Another quality of life feature added to the game through cooking. They also had a hat available from cooking for currencies, which made your cooking time take about half a second each cast, being one of the most useful cooking items you could grab, even to this day. Cataclysm again brought new recipes to cooking along with a skill increase from 450 up to 525. As the Cataclysm didn't have a new continent but rather a new take on the old world, instead of making the new cooking dailies higher level, they took the entirely opposite track. Cooking dailies were added to the major cities and were now available from level 10, and gave a +1 cooking skill, as well as a new currency called Chef's Award. The Cat cooking dailies did not give you a special bags to open with chances at recipes, but if you didn't want to farm cooking mats and just do dailies, for 2 of the Chef Awards you could buy a crate of tasty meat, which had Kata cooking reagents within. Given how short the Cataclysm segment was, you'd think we're over the hump when it comes to cooking, but this is not the case. As you may recall, Mista Pandaria went and flipped cooking on its head. First, some of the more simple changes. The $1 Cooking Award and the Chef's Awards were all replaced with a central currency in the Epicurean Award, which could be obtained from both the $1 and Main City dailies as used for any of those recipes. And if you're wondering what Epicurean means, Epicure is one with sensitive and discriminating taste, especially in food or wine. The Valley of Four Winds is basically an entire zone dedicated to farming and by extension, cooking, And the central hub, Half Hill Market, added a whole system to cooking. With a Sunsong Ranch, you could now grow your own materials, and there was a whole questline and reputation related to that. But also, much like the crafting professions of vanilla, you could now choose different ways to learn each with their own recipes. And once you completely leveled up one, you could start on another. And when you leveled all 6 ways, you earned the title Master of the Ways. Also, unlike in the previous expansions, you could now level up cooking from 1 to 600 all in the Half Hill Market, as they had recipes that required only vendor items and could teach you all the way up to 525, at which point they started to require mats from Pandaria. Mr. Pandaria also gave us a new currency for use in the Half Hill Market called the Iron Paw Token, with which you could buy a 3-piece set of an apron, a rolling pin, and a frying pan, which when all equipped gave you a plus 30 cooking skill. Though unlike the bonuses to fishing skill, you don't really get a bonus from the cooking skill. It's not like you make extra food with a higher cooking skill or anything, but still an interesting bonus to have nonetheless. You could also buy the portable refrigerator, a 32-slot cooking bag, but the most interesting thing that the Half Hill Market gave us was our first interaction with Nami. In Mr. Pandaria, Nami was a child who you mentored into becoming a chef, and you could buy the Cooking Student Bell, which would allow you to summon him. And while nowadays he is so much of a meme that Blizzard has used him as a boss in stress tests, at this point in time he was just a child. Warlords of Draenor brought cooking up from 600 to 700, and for the first time since Wrath, you had to go out into the world to learn this expansion's cooking. Basically, for all the professions of Warlords of Draenor, you got the scrolls to learn their highest level from random mob drops, but the chance was really high, so it was really easy to get them. And fun fact, cooking along with archaeology and first aid are the only professions that didn't get a garrison building dedicated to them. But really, there wasn't much added to cooking, the same type of basic recipes used for high-end content. As we returned to our world for the invasion of Legion, cooking increased from 700 to 800, and we ran into our old student from Mr. Pandaria, Nami. Legion added a new system of cooking, with each recipe now giving 3 ranks, from 1 star to 3 stars. And for cooking, this meant the higher ranks allowed you to make more of the food for the same amount of materials. In addition to this, it had an interesting way to increase the ranks of your recipes. Instead of dailies like in the past, which would give you all the currency, instead you would farm cooking mats and then give them to your old student who was all grown up, in stacks of 5. And he would spend an hour or so researching it, and then you could open a box that would either have some food and a recipe in it, or burnt food scraps. And far more often than not, you would just get the burnt food, which began the meme that Nami was basically just Ragnaros. And for a stress test on the 7.2 PTR, Blizzard let loose Fire Lord Nami on the streets of Dalaran, letting players finally take out their frustrations on their former student for his innumerable failures. There were a couple of interesting recipes from Legion, however. Everyone knows and mourns the bear tartar that was nerfed in BFA, but fewer talk about the interesting ideas that the crispy bacon added, where if you had a food buff and ate a slice of crispy bacon, it increased the duration of the well-fed buff by an hour, all the way up to 6 hours max. Although it only works on food from Legion, so unfortunately it doesn't work anymore. But you do get an achievement for getting a well-fed buff all the way up to 6 hours. Battle for Azeroth changed how professions worked. Instead of going from 800 to 900 or something, it broke professions up to be by expansion. So now you had vanilla cooking, TBC cooking, Wrath cooking, and so on and so forth. It also retrained the 3-rank system of Legion and the 5, 7, 10 amount per recipe. There were a few interesting recipes, like the Heartsbane's Hexwurst, which, like the Deviant Fish in vanilla, transformed you into a pig-headed beastman, which maybe isn't quite as cool as a ninja or pirate. Also, with the release of Mechagon, cooks could now make the Mecha Doll's Big Mech, a clear reference to McDonald's. And with Ny'alotha and the Visions of N'Zoth scenarios, there were a few extra recipes that helped you in those specifically, but for the most part, business as usual. Raid buffs. Finally, in Shadowlands, cooking has a 75 skill to level through. They removed the 3-rank system from cooking, and that's pretty much it. A couple of feasts, a large and small version of every stat food, but the one welcome addition is the fried bonefish, which, while not as strong as bear tartar, is still a nice option for those in old content wanting to speedrun through it. Unlike first aid, cooking is still very widely used even today because of the extra stat buffs it gives. So while its systems are a bit old and maybe even outdated, it's not going anywhere anytime soon.